Hello, if you could all turn your cameras on but leave your microphones muted, the inspectors will join shortly. Thank you. The inspectors have joined the meeting and will take over shortly. Thank you.
Good morning everyone and welcome. It's 9:30 AM and it's time for me to open this hearing session on 12B and 16 relating to the strategic regional residential applications and greenbelt safeguarded land in northwest Widnes. My name is David Troy. I've been appointed jointly with Caroline Malloy to hold this examination to the soundness of the Holton delivery and allocations local plan and to produce a report of our conclusions and recommendations with regard to soundness. Before we begin, can everyone hear and see me? As the majority of you have already attended previous hearing sessions on the plan, I don't intend to go through the formal introduction, but just to cover a few housekeeping issues. Can I just ensure that everyone's make sure the mobile phones are switched off or turned to silent during the hearing sessions? During the hearing sessions, please can you keep your camera switched on for the entire session, if possible, but with your microphones muted until we invite you to speak. We should invite people to speak at a particular time, but if there's something you want to contribute at an appropriate part of the discussion, please indicate you wish to by using the raised hand function in Teams. Does anybody have any procedural questions at this stage? If I could just basically ask the council just to introduce himself initially, and then we'll go to the participants. So if we could just start with the council, please.
Good morning, sir. My name is Alistair Cross. I'm a principal planner for Holton Borough Council.
Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name is John Hunter, and I'm the barrister instructed to represent the council. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, sir. I'm Catherine Brindley and I'm the Principal Planning Officer within the policy team at the Council. Thank you, sir.
Good morning, sir. My name is Jonathan Farmer, Service Manager Highway Development from the Council for the Highway Authority.
Thank you.
Sir, I'm Andrew Plant, the Divisional Manager for Planning and Development. From looking on the screen, sir, I think I'm the final one for the Council.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. Okay, if we just go through the other participants that are here today, Mr. Harper, Mr. Harper today again.
Right, good morning. It's Phil and Colleen Harper. We're representing the residents of North Widnes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you, sir. Brian O'Connor from Litchfield, representing Taylor MP. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Thomas from Cronton Parish Council. Yeah, just unmute yourself there, Mr. Thomas. Thank you.
Yeah, my name's David Thomas. I'm representing Cronton Parish Council today. Good morning to you all. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think those that are coming to the session on Pexhill are Joe McGrath, Miss McGrath.
Good morning, sir. Yeah, Joe McGrath from Saplan, representing Norlands Farm.
And Mr. Mitchell.
Good morning, everyone. Dan Mitchell from Barton Wilmore, representing S3 Holdings. Thank you.
Okay, I think, is that all participants? Yes, so thank you very much. Okay, so if we start with the agenda, basically we're looking at the strategic allocation at Northwest Widnes. So if we could just start with the council, if in relation to the sites in Northwest Widnes, if they could just provide some background to the site allocations, how they're identified and what options were considered.
Thank you, sir. Obviously, it's a bit of a replay of yesterday's discussion. The need for a Greenbelt review was first established in the examination to the core strategy in 2010. That committed the Borough Council to undertaking a Greenbelt review around Widnes and Hale. In the preparation of the DAO, the Council concluded that it also had to look at a wider Greenbelt review, also including Runcorn. We believe exceptional circumstances exist. There's not sufficient land available within the urban area to meet the development requirements for the communities north and south of the river. We then undertook a Greenbelt review to assess the importance of the Greenbelt function of the parcels across the borough. That was a comprehensive study. It looked at all of the Greenbelt within the borough, not just selected sites on settlement edges. The council then basically proposed a number of areas be removed from the Greenbelt, either for immediate allocation for housing development or for later or reservation for potential later development at a later date in the form of safeguarded land. Today's discussion, we're looking at primarily at sites W4, W5 in northwest Widnes, basically the land between the belt area of Widnes heading out towards Cronton Village. The council is very aware that that does represent a narrowing of the gap between the urban area of Widnes and Cronton. However, we would, I'm sure we'll get to the discussion, we would point out that it is effectively sort of filling in an indent in the Greenbelt boundary, and actually the development wouldn't encroach much further or much closer to the village than other areas of urban development within Widnes.
Okay, and just the second part of that question, obviously, what other options have been considered, just to be sure?
Effectively, I say the council, we did undertake a comprehensive Greenbelt study. We did look at all the potential options. The borough is tightly constrained. The borough boundary is drawn tight to the belt area across a lot of the boundary of across a lot of Widnes. The scope for development is quite limited. Effectively, we are limited to the urban edge. We don't have large Greenbelt and the opportunity for creating new settlements or new garden villages. We can either look to land to the north of Widnes, or we can look to land to the south of Widnes. So effectively, if we're heading south into Hale Bank, we are proposing allocations in both locations, both north and south. We had proposed some additional land in south Widnes in an earlier iteration of the plan, but with the reduction in the housing number between the publication draft and the proposed submission draft, we have re-looked at the options, and I say we've reduced the amount of land required to be released particularly in South Widnes and Hale Bank, much of which is actually affected by constraints, including supporting habitat for the Ramsar ecological site. The council believes that the mix of sites proposed is appropriate and is deliverable.
And just in terms of, obviously, some of the discussion yesterday was about the alternative options that were considered, re the safeguarded sites at Pex Hill, and also the site we spoke about yesterday at Norcott, the garden centre, basically as alternative, and also a larger allocation, I understand, at Lunsheath Road. So those alternatives were considered versus this one. Is that right? I understand that's the same situation here.
Yes, sir. The land at Lunsheath Road, I say, in the version of the version of the proposed publication draft that was submitted to committee for consideration, did include significantly more development of the land at the back of Lunsheath Road. Members did not feel able to support that proposal, and that area was struck out and did not appear in the publication draft that was submitted, put out for consultation. Subsequently, I say, after that consultation, with the reduction in the housing number, and the members felt able to support a smaller allocation in that location, and that's now basically included within this plan as allocation W49. With the reduction in the housing number, then some of the sites that had previously been recommended for allocation for housing development have actually now been, we now feel that they are not required at this time, and they're not justified to allocate them for housing at this time, and they've been, to use the phrase, downgraded to safeguarded land. So they are sites that the council is not saying are not developable, they're just saying those sites that are not required. We have looked at the various sites in the round, and we believe that the pattern of development that we're putting forward is the most appropriate in the circumstances.
Okay, has anybody got any comments to raise at this stage on that point? Obviously, we'll go into the detail of the greenbelt issues shortly. Yep, Mr. Mitchell.
Good morning, thank you, sir. We've got some comments on relation to Pex Hill, so we'll save that for the second part of this morning. I just wanted to touch on this sort of process of change that went on. I believe that happened around about the start of 2019. I think there was some plans taken to executive committee which were then changed. And Mr. Cross alluded to members were supportive of some sites and not supportive of others. Just wanted to ask about that process at that point, because I also understand that the spatial approach to strategic allocations and strategic locations changed, because at that point Northeast Widnes and Northwest Widnes were effectively combined into North Widnes. So I wanted to ask whether at that point where the plan was changing, how and what was the process, and was there some sort of re-ranking of sites in any way, or is it really still reliant on the council's 2017 evidence base? Because that's what we've struggled with throughout the course of this local plan, is how that change was effectively made, and whether there is any evidence to support then the choice of sites that resulted.
Okay, and I'll just take Mr. Harper's question as well, please. Mr. and Mrs. Harper's.
Thank you very much. I was just pointing out really that reduction in housing number of 2,688 between the first draft publication and the final draft essentially resulted in an increased housing from Northeast Widnes, no change at all to Northwest Widnes, and all the benefit essentially went to Hale. But in terms of Hale, the actual land that was taken out of Greenbelt wasn't returned to Greenbelt, but just everything else was just put into safeguarded land. So it's not as if that land has been identified as undeliverable. It's just that the land has now been put into future housing use, essentially. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Cross, do you want to just come back on those questions, if you could, just regarding this site selection and just obviously the number reduction in terms of houses, basically in relation to how that affected this particular strategic allocation?
Thank you, sir. I can deal with the first part in terms of the reduction of land at Hale. It's incorrect to say that none of the land was returned to the green belt. Effectively, some of the proposed safeguarded sites at Hale were returned back into the green belt. Some of the allocations, proposed allocations, yes, were basically transferred or downgraded to safeguarded land. I'm a little confused sometimes, with Mr. Mitchell's position, because he's been repeating this repeatedly for quite a while. I don't think that it's overly complicated. The fact that the council officers recommended the allocation of the land at the back of Lunts Heath Road is on record. So you can look up the committee report, it's still online. The fact that council members declined to support a plan that contained that allocation is not overly complicated. Effectively, it is the council's plan, it's not the officer's plan. The council felt unable to support the plan that contained that allocation. Effectively, I think the members have very long memories, and they know that promoting development, particularly of that scale and that location, does receive a degree of public pushback, and they felt uncomfortable with the overall level of development proposed in North Widnes, and instructed officers to make a change. The change was made, the plan was consulted upon. Then subsequently, we have had a reduction in the overall housing number. That's allowed officers again to make additional recommendations to the council. We have obviously, with discussions with members, it became clear that they felt that they might be able to support a more modest allocation of the land at Lunts Heath Road. And the proposal that includes W49 was put to members. Members felt able to support that, and that was the version that made its way into the proposed submission draft that was consulted on and is before you today.
Okay, thank you. Right, I'm going to, unless there's anything else, I'm just going to move on just to the planning status.
So can I just come back on that point, to clarify what I was asking, because in the 2018 consultation, the whole of what was referred to as W49, the Lunts Heath Road allocation, was in the Greenbelt. And at that point, the Pex Hill site was called W06 and was an allocation. And this is the point I'm making, is that there's then the complete role reversal. So my client site at Pex Hill was, you've heard me use the term downgraded to safeguarded land. And at that point, W49 came in. Now the yield and the size of WA49 is bigger than the Pex Hill site. So the argument that's been put to you to say, well, it was only changed on the basis of a reduction in numbers can't be right, because a bigger site's come in than the one that effectively fell out. So that's really what I'm getting at in terms of that change.
Could I just, Mr. Mitchell, because you are, I appreciate, I think we're probably going to go into this probably in a bit more detail under the safeguarded discussions. I think the focus of the discussion this morning really is to do with Northwest, actually the W4 and W5, and I think for what I can see you're talking about is really Pex Hill versus obviously the Lunts Heath Road site. I wonder if we could just part of that discussion maybe till later, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine.
I understand the argument, but I do feel probably what I want to try and focus on is the actual Northwest Widnes allocation, the background to those if could this morning, and then if we could move on, and maybe if we could just maybe raise that later, if that's okay, Mr. Mitchell.
That's fine, and it's important because my site was part of the strategic location in the first place. So
yeah, I understand that. Thank you. Okay, if we just we could come back to that, thank you. So I just wanted to just come onto the second item relating to the planning history status of the sites, W4 and W5. So if the council could just give me an update basically in relation to those sites, if they could please, W4 and W5, and then I'll just ask for the developers' views on this as well.
Yes, thank you. So I think the sites W4, particularly along Chapel, the boundary of Chapel Lane, there are some residential properties which I think have been subject to, a couple of them are comparatively new, so there will be some individual residential permissions or applications along the bottom edge of the site, but there have not been any substantive applications for development across the wider bulk of either W4 or W5.
Okay, thank you. Just Mr. O'Connor, I believe, is it?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, sir. I would agree with what Mr. Cross has to say. I suppose the only thing I would add is in terms of background information on this site, following on from the core strategy adoption, Taylor Wimpey went through a process of site selection and identified the W4, W5 site as the most logical site back in 2013, 2014, and have been actively promoting this site since 2015. There was a development document prepared in 2015, which included a master plan for how W4 and W5 would be brought forward together, and continuously throughout the intervening 6 years, Taylor Wimpey have actively promoted this site at all opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the Greenbelt review conclusions and the effect on the Greenbelt. So if I could ask just in relation to each of the sites in North West Widnes, starting obviously with W4, whether the council could just briefly outline the findings of the Greenbelt review, specifically in relation to the land in question, and basically just go through the purposes of how those contributed to the purposes of the Greenbelt. So if we could just start with probably the first purpose in terms of the check and restricted sprawl of large built-up areas.
Thank you, sir. The summary of the purposes for the conclusions of the Greenbelt study are set out in our statement to question 12.B.3, which basically looked at the various parcels across and including the group site. The group site was Group G, included both sites, W4 and W5, and concluded that it made a moderate contribution towards the purposes of including land within the Greenbelt. I think to say it's quite clear that, yes, the Greenbelt, as was discussed yesterday, is very narrow around around large parts of the Liverpool City region. This is a narrow gap. We accepted it as a narrow gap, and effectively we are, reducing the gap between the, say, as mentioned, the built-up area of Widnes and Cronton. I say we would say, however, and as you can probably see, is demonstrated in our map appended or included within our statement, where we've shown the Greenbelt width in 100-metre bands. I say we would say that the narrowing of the gap, whilst it's reducing it to about 500 metres, the gap to Cronton from the Widnes built-up area is already 500 metres in certain locations, particularly around the New Upton Rocks development at Pexhill Court and around the older developments in North Widnes around Newsham Close. They're both also about 500 metres distant from Cronton. So we see this as effectively a little bit of rounding. So it's not ideal to reduce the gap to 500 metres. It's not something that I say we would prefer to do, but I say given the circumstances and looking at the situation in the round, we think it is justified.
Okay, just going through the other purposes, basically, just whilst we're looking at them. Also, you've touched obviously on the preventing the neighbouring towns merging into one another. You've looked at that purpose. It's obviously just the other purpose I think you touched on in your Greenbelt review was obviously safeguarding the countryside from encroachment.
Yes, effectively as part of the review, we did look at the existence of existing boundaries within the greenbelt, or potential greenbelt boundaries, to make sure that any proposed, any change, any boundary that would become the new greenbelt boundary could have a degree of permanence. Effectively, we are building or proposing to build up to the borough boundary, but coincidentally, the borough boundary is also demarcated by a watercourse. So we feel that that does present a permanent and physical feature that would form a strong greenbelt edge in this location.
Okay, just touching on the again the greenbelt review in terms of the potential strength of boundaries in relation to W4 and W5. I think you've touched on the northern boundary there. If you just explain to me basically what the outcome of those in terms of potential strength of boundaries were. If you could just literally advise me in relation to those.
Obviously, looking at the site, to taking the two sites together. W4, the western boundary, is formed by Chapel Lane. The northern boundary would be formed by the watercourse. If the sites were split, they're separated by Sandy Lane, a current greenway. W5, again, the northern boundary, is largely demarcated by a watercourse, and the eastern boundary is demarcated by Queensbury Way, the new sort of district distributor road serving the Upton Rocks development.
But the outcome of the actual review indicated these were potentially strong boundaries. Those particular boundaries. Of course,
they're strong physical boundaries.
I'm just trying to get at the actual review actually indicated. So potential strength in those was stronger. Is that right? Is that correct?
The boundary strengths are shown in the Greenbelt study. I'm just looking for if I can get you the map reference number. So it's the map that's very counterintuitive, because the strong boundaries I think are shown in green, whereas your mind thinks they should be in red. Just trying to find it's on page 75 of EL 003.
Okay, thank you.
And of course, should both sites be released from the greenbelt, then it would be the northern boundary would become the greenbelt boundary, and the western boundary to Chapel Lane would become the greenbelt boundary. The other boundaries would effectively be edges to the existing urban area, so they would not be new greenbelt edges.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Harper, if you want to come in here, please.
Thank you very much. I was very interested to hear from Mr. Cross that 500 metres is an acceptable amount for a green belt extension. What was interesting also is in the assessment that was undertaken, almost everything ends up as moderate or less, because it specifically says that this that the impact of developing W4, W5 would have an important impact on the distance between settlements, reducing the distance to Cronton to less than 500 metres. And yet it's assessed as moderate. It's possibly taking something like 30% off the distance between that section of Widnes and that section of Cronton. I'm just appalled that that's moderate. Surely it's a major impact on the greenbelt in that situation.
And if I could just throw my 2 pence in the mouth, so we've got the microphone open. My view is that if you've only got a small amount of greenbelt, there should be even greater protection of it, rather than the smallness being used as a reason to get rid of it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you, sir. In addition to Mr. Cross, the Greenbelt review shows that there's only one other site in Northwest Widnes which has a slightly less contribution to the Greenbelt, that being the Middle Lane site, which has also been identified for release. So our site scores relatively well in accordance with the methodology in the Greenbelt review. I suppose the only thing I would also add in relation to the northern boundary, the master plan which has been put forward by Taylor Wimpey for the site recognises the importance of this northern boundary, and is proposing a setback distance from the boundary and a linear park along that boundary with the watercourse. Given the scale of the site, it's also likely that there'll be different character areas being developed as part of the master plan, with potentially lower densities along the northern boundary to lessen the visual impact along there, as well as ensuring that there's a strong defensible boundary moving forward to the greenbelt. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to that point in a minute about the northern boundary. Just obviously this question that Mr. and Ms. Harper just raised there, Mr. Cross, just regarding obviously the importance really of in relation to a bit of land that obviously is narrowing. In this case, have you got any sort of comments to make on that at this stage?
Yes, thank you, sir. As I say, it's probably, as you have reference to the maps on page 78 and 79 of EL03, sort of the thematic maps that show the gaps that would be wet if individual sites were developed. And obviously, yes, you can see that there's darker shading on the sites, particularly around North Widnes as you head out towards Cronton or head out towards Hale. Obviously, say at yesterday's session, Mr. Harper was complaining about the Greenbelt gap affecting the sites that were discussed yesterday in North East Widnes, and again bemoaning the lack of Greenbelt gap. And those were basically some of the sites that have the largest gap around North Widnes. Again, I say obviously, yes, I say that it would be preferable if the Greenbelt gap could be wider, but we are in a very constrained urban area. Again, I would draw your attention to the map in our statement, which does show the 100-metre bandings. And again, we would say that whilst we are reducing or increasing the amount of development within the 600, 700-metre area, there are already parts of North Widnes that are within the 500 or just touching the 500-metre from the bottom edge of Cronton. So we're encroaching towards, but we are not actually making the minimum gap smaller than it already exists.
Okay, good. Yeah, Mr. Thomas, I think you've got your hand raised.
Yes, representing Cronton Parish Council, we're most concerned about this reduction in Greenbelt gap. In the documentation I'm looking at, the quoted gaps are reduced to quite significantly less than 500 metres, in fact. And in your own words in the documentation, this land is considered to provide an important role in preventing neighbouring towns from merging. And this is where we are most concerned, that this development, if it takes place, reduces the gap considerably. It also takes away a very rural greenbelt walk that people use from this location down Sandy Lane. Of course, if it was ever to become developed, then half of that walk would be lost to development, wouldn't be the same surroundings at all. So we as a parish council are very much concerned by this reduction in gap and the encroachment it has on the greenbelt land in this particular location. And I don't think it's right that just because a gap exists already and it's less than 500 metres, that supports the fact that you can go ahead with the development. So I'd just like to make a few points like that. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Harper, you've still got your hand raised. Is that?
Sorry. Yes. I just don't take I don't agree. I was moaning yesterday. By the way, I would like Mr. Cross to take that back.
Okay, I think the point was raised. Obviously, I understand the discussion, obviously, on the gap that was obviously raised yesterday. Obviously, today's obviously a different position. Obviously, I think we have to talk about the site specifics in relation to that. So I think obviously we're talking about the gap between now and Cronton, really. So if we could just focus on that, really. But yeah, appreciate that comment. Just one other thing I basically wanted just to raise in terms of the review itself, and I think we've touched on it about the boundary, particular northwest boundary. In the Greenbelt review, there was two parcels of land I picked out from the Greenbelt review. There was GB006 and GB008. on the northwestern part of site W4 that made a significant contribution to the purpose of safeguarding the countryside from encroachment and maintaining the gap between the settlement of Widnes and Cronton. I think is it justified to include this area, basically, given obviously it's the comment was made about obviously having a significant contribution in the review, and can the boundary be changed or removed, and what alternative options were looked at? So, Mr. Cross, if you just come back on that point, I just wanted to just drill down a little bit more into this particular element of the review.
Sorry, sir, it was GB006 and what was the other side?
008. There's only two parcels of land. There's two parcels of land on the northwest edge of W4, which effectively had a significant contribution in individual parcels.
Again, I think we were in a similar situation yesterday. It's where you're looking at as the individual plots, where obviously the plots on the outer edge being assessed individually will score higher, particularly in terms of the containment, because they will be segregated or separated from the urban area and will not be classed as contiguous, so that would boost their score. Obviously, on the outer edge, then yes, they also would score higher in terms of the function of the gap. If you were to support the release of the sites immediately to the south of I'm looking at GB06, then the score would change, because it would then have a substantial area of the boundary that would be contiguous to the urban area, which would reduce its greenbelt score in that regard. I'm just having a look now at GB08.
A pretty similar position, really. They're more or less next door to each other, effectively.
Oh yes, sorry. It's I was just getting my bearings on the map. Again, it's, I say slightly a similar position. I say if you were to propose support the release of the land, the site immediately to the east of that parcel, again, that would probably make about 40% of the boundary would be contiguous with the urban area. That again would also affect the overall score. I say obviously that's why we also did the assessment in terms of groupings. And so I say the sites were assessed as part of the wider group, and the greenbelt function assessed as a whole, which obviously for this group grouping showed a moderate contribution overall. I'm just having a quick look at the boundaries to say, because I don't think that there are the existing potential strong boundaries between those two sites and the remainder of the proposed allocation. Which again, we're looking at the map on page 75 of EL03, and again, looks like there's not the presence of strong boundaries between those two sites and the remainder of the proposed allocation, which again would suggest that the site should be the wider site should be considered as a whole, rather than breaking down into individual parcels.
Could I just bring Mr. O'Connor in there? I think you touched on this issue really earlier. That I wanted to, obviously because of the review's findings, I was basically wanting to sort of find out what how this would be addressed in terms of that particular northern boundary. I think you touched on it, how the impact of this area could be dealt with in terms of the overall impact of sites W4 in this case, but obviously particularly those parcels of land and how the northern boundary would be dealt with.
I suppose in our opinion, the outcome of the significant contribution set out in the scoring of GB006 and GB008 are almost a function of the methodology that was applied in selecting the parcels of land. Obviously, the outer parcels of land will always score worse than parcels closer to the urban settlement, and we were obviously strongly of the opinion that you needed to view this site as a whole, W4, W5, so that we were fully in support of the Group G assessment, which was undertaken by the council as part of that Greenbelt review, and that would be our kind of preferred methodology for looking at this. Moving on to your point on the northern boundary, obviously it's something that we are fully aware of and have factored in as part of our master plan. We're of the opinion that using Alderbrook as the permanent and defensible boundary is the most appropriate boundary, and it offers a stronger protection than any boundary further south than that, closer to the urban edge. And it, as part of our master planning of this site as well, we're kind of bringing forward a master plan which is cognizant of this and tries to enhance that boundary as well.
How would you enhance it? I think you touched on it.
So
just so I'm be clear,
introduce a linear park as part of that, so there would be tree planting and other such landscape features which would enhance the permeability or defensiveness and permanence of that boundary.
So there'd be additional landscaping buffer and a natural sort of green space effectively running along.
Yeah.
Is this along just W4? Would it go along?
So no, it's along W4 and W5. So I'm sure if you've seen, yes. So our development vision statement, it's on page 36, the master plan that we put forward. So it's not the developer's intention to develop right up to the boundary. There is an offset from the boundary to allow the incorporation of a linear park along that northern edge.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Mr. Thomas. Yeah.
I don't think I've got my hand up actually.
Oh, right. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, is your raised hands function, but that's fine.
Okay,
that's absolutely fine. No problem. Yep. So thank you for that. So we touched on so just in terms of what would the effect of the proposed housing allocation be on the land or the purposes of the Greenbelt? What would the effect of the proposed site allocations be on the purposes of the land within the Greenbelt? Because you asked Mr. So we've obviously looked at what the current position is and what the effect would be on the purposes of the Greenbelt once if it was developed. Mr. Cross.
Thank you, sir. Again, obviously, as you say, yes, it's probably the prime importance of land in this location is the gap in terms of maintaining the separation of settlements. Obviously, as you say, we are looking at the border boundary. The land on the other side of the boundary is Greenbelt. That's been reconfirmed in the adopted Knowsley plan, which I think is about 4 years old. I don't think they have a timetable for reviewing their plan. The last Knowsley plan did release significant amount of land from the Greenbelt, but obviously confirmed the importance of the Greenbelt gap in this location between the bottom end of Cronton and the top end of Widnes. Obviously it's the council of Halton is proposing to build up to our boundary, but we can consider that Knowsley will maintain the Greenbelt on the other side, so the gap will be preserved in the long term.
Okay, I think, and if I could just move on to the question of exceptional circumstances in relation to the sites in Northwest Widnes, if you could just really clarify what the site-specific exceptional circumstances are in relation to these particular sites. Why would basically what the exceptional circumstances are to the Greenbelt on this specific location, please?
Again, thank you, sir. As we discussed yesterday, the evidence supports that there is insufficient land within the Widnes and Hale, so land north of the border, in order to meet the development needs of that community. So there's exceptional circumstances have been established to warrant the release of Greenbelt land to meet those development requirements. In terms of the individual sites, I say the council has undertaken a comprehensive greenbelt study. We have taken a comprehensive approach. We've looked at all the possible greenbelt land within the borough, just to meet our requirements, and have concluded that the sites that have been put forward in the plan represent, if you like to use the phrase, the least worst option in terms of releasing additional land from the greenbelt. As was discussed yesterday, we have obviously gone through the appropriate search criteria. We have looked for land within our own urban area. We have also been in discussion with all the neighbouring authorities. The two neighbouring authorities within our housing market area are St Helens and Warrington. Warrington is in the process of producing a plan that is proposing a huge amount of greenbelt release to meet their own development requirements. St Helens is preparing a plan which is currently at examination, which similarly contains proposals for release of land from the greenbelt in order to meet the needs of St Helens. In terms of the neighbouring authorities not within the same housing market area, as I just mentioned, Knowsley have recently adopted a plan about 4 years or so ago that released significant amount of land from the greenbelt to meet their own requirements, and Liverpool are currently at examination. They don't have significant areas of greenbelt, but they are looking at releasing some land within their own greenbelt to meet their own requirements, although that is probably more for specific requirements regarding the airport and employment land rather than residential. So effectively, none of the neighbouring authorities are in a position to meet displaced, unmet need from Halton without recourse to their own greenbelt.
Okay, Mr. O'Connor, have you got any comments from a developer perspective on the exceptional circumstances that apply to these specific sites from a developer's perspective, please?
Yeah, from our perspective, we're of the opinion as set out in Matter 8 that exceptional circumstances have been demonstrated and the council have complied with the right approach as set out in 137 of the MPPF. Obviously, the core strategy 8 years ago identified that there was going to be a need for greenbelt release in Widnes to meet future needs, and this is the next plan which has moved on from that. I suppose the last thing I'd like in terms of the site specific, we're of the opinion that this site effectively rounds off the settlement in this part of the area, and it's meeting the needs of Widnes in line with the spatial strategy as set out in the plan.
Any other comments from other participants regarding the site-specific issues in relation to exceptional circumstances that apply to Northwest Widnes, if basically they consider or not consider whether they apply or not?
So can I just raise a point? It's a sort of legal viewpoint. So I just wonder whether it would be helpful for me, in order to assist you in your process, to prepare a note on the relevant law relating to exceptional circumstances. So, because I know obviously one of the points we keep coming back to is the need for site-specific consideration of the test, which I agree with. But so I just wonder whether it, as I say, might be helpful, because I think what it seems to me the authorities say about that is the test has to be applied at a site-specific level. But that doesn't mean that the considerations which factor into the exceptional circumstances test, in particular housing need, the unavailability of reasonable alternatives or whatever, have to be site-specific themselves. It's the assessment. So it just seemed to me that it might be useful if I were to do that, if you were to allow me to submit that on behalf of the council.
I think that probably would be a benefit, basically just to the wider discussion. I mean, I think basically, as you say, we're trying to we understand the general point about obviously the exceptional circumstances generally applied, obviously when we discuss Matter 8, but we're trying to look obviously site specifically at each site now to find out where those exceptional circumstances apply. But by all means, that you can obviously that would be of some help. Thank you.
Thank you,
Mr. Hunter. Yes, Mr. Thomas, I think you've still got your hand raised. Thank you.
I just want to go back to the comment that I think it's Mr. Cross, I just can't quite see your name on the screen, was making. I mean, obviously, we're most concerned about protecting the distance between the Halton boundary and obviously Cronton. And I don't think it's right to say that. I've forgotten my train. I'm sorry. Sorry, I've forgotten my train of thought there. Let me just sorry. Just let me.
By all means, I think one of the points I wanted just to raise, obviously in terms of the points that have been raised, obviously in terms of this rounding issue, obviously the point was raised, obviously in terms of the way the areas around are basically aligned at the moment. Is that considered to be sort of a sufficient ground to in this particular site to consider basically the development of this specific area? Is that correct, Mr. Cross?
I would say certainly a consideration. As I said, with reference to the banding map, the 100-metre bands in our statement, you can see quite clearly that there is an indent in the green belt in this location, and so the distance from the bottom of Cronton to Chapel Lane is larger than the distance from the bottom of Cronton to Pexhill Court and to Newsham Close, which are located to the eastern and western parts. So effectively this is a little bit of sort of like rounding off the settlement, as Mr. O'Connor described it. Yes, to say it is narrowing the gap to the boundary with Widnes in terms of the Chapel Lane, but to say it's in terms of encroaching closer towards Cronton than the existing urban area of Widnes, it's if it does so, it's in terms of a matter of metres rather than in tens or hundreds of metres.
Okay, Mr. Thomas, do you want to come back in there? You just need to unmute yourself, thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Cross was talking about the fact that Knowsley would keep its land to north of your plots, W4 and W5, I think. And I don't think you can use that argument to say that because Knowsley are going to keep that as Greenbelt land, we can therefore go up to the northern boundary that you describe in these ditches. Because you should be coming at it from the perspective of protecting the Greenbelt land gap between the two entities, between Widnes and between Cronton, and therefore you should not be proposing this land to be used for development. And that's what I wanted. The point was that I don't think you can just rely on Knowsley keeping its Greenbelt land to keep this gap.
Okay, Mr. Harper, please, or Mr. Harper.
Yes, thank you very much. Mr. Cross was again justifying Greenbelt being 500 metres wide and saying that justifies releasing this land. And of course, we can't go past our boundary. I mean, I'm sure Mr. Cross would like to be able to extend the boundary to go even closer to Cronton by basing what was being said. If you look at the map, it specifically is a bulge. You'd have to take anything of GB 0, 5, 6, 7 and 8 encroaches further towards Cronton than the current sort of alignment of the urban area. The earlier one, the small ones in the corner, GB 1 to 4, you could accept. We're just rounding off. Thank you very much.
Thank you. May I also throw in my two pence? I'd like to back up what Mr. Thomas has said with regard to this council relying on another council to provide that little green belt gap. But it does concern me from what's being said that the green belt throughout this section between Liverpool and Manchester is being encroached on hugely, and if we're not careful, you are going to have urban sprawl all the way from the Irish Sea up to the Pennines.
Mr. Cross, if you just come back on this point regarding obviously Mr. Thomas and Mr. Harper's comments regarding the issue of Knowsley, obviously maintaining their green belt within their land is justification for the development here. And obviously, I think the other point was raised about whether this is a bulge or a rounding off of the actual the urban area. Would you just cover those 2 points for me? Thank you.
Yes, thank you, sir. Just before I do, I would just like to just to clarify. I think Mr. Harper misheard me. I didn't say that he was moaning about the greenbelt gap. I said he was bemoaning. I hope that that clarifies that point. In terms of saying that we can rely on Knowsley, no, we're not intending to say that it's okay. Halton would happily build out all the way to Cronton, but you're being saved by another authority. That's not the position. But I was just trying to give some reassurance, both to the parish council, Mr. Thomas, the parish council, and to yourselves, that the green belt has been looked at by the neighbouring authority, which does cover the area north of our boundary, and it was recently reconfirmed and retained as green belt in a plan that is no more than about 4 years old. So effectively, just to try and give some reassurance that the chance of the gap being totally closed seems a distant or an unlikely prospect, because whenever it was looked at by the neighbouring authority, they concluded that the gap was important, and they did not propose development within that locality, which in their plan, which I say was releasing land for greenbelt from the greenbelt to meet development requirements, I'm sure did consider. And say in terms of Halton, we've discussed previously, we believe exceptional circumstances exist. There's not sufficient identified land within the urban area. We have to go into the green belt. There's very little opportunity. We either go north or south. The plan has a balanced mix of both. We consider that this site presents a reasonable area for development. It does allow the creation of a strong green belt boundary. It's in a sustainable location, and it is eminently developable and would meet the needs or contribute towards meeting the needs of the residents of Widnes.
Good, thank you, Ms. Cross. Is there any other points now to raise on the green belt findings or exceptional circumstances at this stage before I move on to the next part of the agenda? If I could. Thank you for your contributions. Just in terms of the next part of the agenda, just relating to this scale and dwelling capacity of the sites. So in relation to each of the sites in Northwest Widnes, starting with site W4, and then going on to W5, if please could the council state how was the site area and the dwelling capacity determined, and basically, and then also whether the assumptions are justified and based on available evidence, having regard to the constraints and provision of necessary infrastructure.
Again, thank you, sir. The site capacities were assessed as 299 and 132 units respectively. The calculation is set out in our statement under the response to question 12B.5. Effectively, we look at the site area. Depending upon the size of the site, we apply an assumption about the developable the proportion of the site that's developable. As both sites are above 5 hectares, we assume that 70% is developable in terms of generating housing, and multiply by the minimum density requirements that are contained within the plan, which is 30 dwellings per hectare. So it's 14.2 hectares times 70% times 30 for W4, and it's 6.3 hectares times 70% times 30 for W5, and it gives a total capacity, a notional capacity across the site of 431.
Okay. And just in terms of obviously the constraints and provision of the necessary structure, that you feel that those assumptions correctly take those into account. Obviously, we'll come on to those shortly, but yes, sir. The developable area assumptions were informed by
a document that you do have in front of you. I'm sure one of my colleagues might ping me the reference number. We looked at the delivery of housing across a range of sites over a number of years across the whole of Halton, sites of differing sizes, to assess the amount of area that was basically given over to housing and the amount of area that was given over to supporting infrastructure, such as estate roads, structural landscaping, SUDs, etc. And that informed the development assumptions that have been used throughout the plan.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Connor, just so I could get the developer's view, obviously on the same questions, really, please, whether you accept that or not.
Thank you, sir. We applied a different methodology in deriving our capacity for the site, albeit we did come to a very similar conclusion as Mr. Cross. We appointed a landscape architect back in 2015 who undertook a detailed exercise to derive the capacity of the site, and we've been promoting that the site can deliver approximately 100 or 450 units. That's taken into account the constraints on site, the need for the incorporation of a linear park buffer along the northern boundary, the public right-of-ways through the site, and ensuring that we can be policy compliant on POS and delivering other infrastructure on site as well.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Harper.
Sorry, I was the original question I was going to raise was to Mr. Cross, asking if he took account of the linear park, but in fact what happened is that the numbers that Mr. Cross came up with are actually lower than the ones that sorry, Mr. Connor, is it? Said there. So he's talking 450. So we're actually having a higher density despite the linear park in these sites than the council's assumptions.
And Mr. Thomas, have you got a comment to make on this?
Sorry, my question is just a similar one to Mr. Harper about, have these numbers taken into consideration the boundary that Mr. O'Connor was talking about?
Okay.
Yes. Sorry. If I may. Yes.
Okay, Mr. O'Connor, then if you go back to Mr. Cross, really, thank you. Yeah.
Apologies. Yes, our consideration did take into account the need for the boundary treatment along the northern edge of the site.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cross, if you just wanted to clarify, obviously, the assumptions again, basically, obviously, I think there's a figure there. I think that you've come up with a figure of 431, I think, looking at your submission, and Mr. O'Connor, it's 450, I think, from what was stated in terms of overall site capacity.
Yes, thank you, sir. As I say, it's probably down to, the developable area. The document I was referring to, I believe, is in the library, is EL094, and it's Housing Sites Developable Area Estimates Briefing Note. As I say, we looked at a large number of sites across the whole of the borough to establish the average, if you like, in terms of the developable area on sites of different size. I think the plan does stress, or does it pains to stress, that the capacities quoted are notional capacities. They are informed by, the standard formula, which we believe is robust. However, obviously, whenever the developers or promoters actually carry out the detailed design work, get on site and look in more detail, then the numbers may change. They may go up, they may go down. In this case, it appears that they've gone up slightly, but if my arithmetic is correct, it looks like, it's within a margin of 10%. So I think, if anything, it validates the approach that the council's taken, because obviously we are assessing a huge number of sites and we haven't carried out detailed design work on all of them. But we think our approach is robust and has produced figures across all the sites that seem to be corresponding quite closely with the figures that are now being prepared or produced by the development community.
Okay, thank you. Just going to move on to the potential adverse impacts and mitigations. Basically, again, if just ask the council in relation to each of the sites in Northwest Widnes, starting with site W4 again, looking on to W5, can the council state what potential adverse impacts are of developing the site and how they would be mitigated, please?
Thank you, sir. Again, we've included a table for summarising the conclusions of the BSA, which looked at 17 criterion. The main negative potential impact is on soil, which is effectively reflective of the loss of agricultural land. There are a few other potential negative impacts in terms of heritage, which again will probably be relating to the loss of agricultural land and landscape features. In terms of health and transport, some negative potential impacts, which is again probably down to the proximity or lack of proximity to certain infrastructure. We did discuss yesterday about bus services, and I believe that the majority of this site is within these sites are within 400 metres of a bus stop. I think there are parts of the northwestern corner of W4, or the westernmost extent of W4 might be slightly outside that, but the majority of the site is within 400 metres. The health is identified as potential negative effects. Again, I think part of that might well be down to the proximity or lack of proximity to local health facilities, but as was mentioned yesterday, there are proposals which the council is strongly supportive of to provide a new health GP practice at the Upton Rocks local centre, which is located just a short distance to the south of these sites.
Okay, and do you think the policy safeguards and the proposed mitigation measures are sufficient to, in relation to this site, to deal with those potential adverse impacts?
Yes, sir. In fact, I've just got one of my colleagues pinging me some information regarding the bus services, which I'm sure you'll come on to. I believe that there's a number 26A runs along Queensferry Avenue every 2 hours, and the number 7 along Cronton every 30 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Just get the developer's view, really, just in relation to the same issues, really, if I could, please, just in terms of potential adverse impacts and basically how those would be mitigated, please.
Yeah, just reiterating, as part of our master planning exercise for the site, there was work undertaken in relation to landscape, ecology, highways, flood risk and drainage, and all that's been factored into the master plan for the site, and is anticipated that any adverse impacts can be mitigated on site, but if not, appropriate Section 106 contributions can be afforded for off-site improvements if needed.
Could you just touch on some of the points raised, obviously, in the site assessments, particularly in relation to biodiversity, obviously, in terms of and how they would be addressed? Mr. O'Connor might answer this question. Basically, I note, obviously, in relation to W4, obviously there's a linear feature, which is obviously the ditch and hedgerow on the northern boundary, but also there's obviously a woodland area that's north of Old Upton, sort of road there. And then in relation to the W5, obviously it's quite an extensive area of woodland area on the eastern side of the site by Queensbury Way, which I saw when I was basically on site. Obviously, all of those are identified as core biodiversity areas in the ecological network, the Liverpool City Region NIA ecological network. I just wanted to see how those would be addressed, basically how those would be mitigated as part of the actual overall proposal, please.
Yeah, the intention is that as much as possible of the existing features on site, hedgerows, trees, public right of way, and such linear features will be retained as part of the master plan. And where they can't be, it would be appropriate mitigation provided on site.
And just to be clear, obviously, particularly into the woodland areas, because they're fairly extensive areas that are obviously in terms of they are within the boundaries of W4. They basically are they to be retained as part of the master planning, and also the site along the Queensbury Way, because obviously I can see obviously the obviously the benefits in terms of the overall plan. So I just wanted to touch on those.
The master plan we put forward retained a lot of the Queensbury Way woods along the eastern boundary of the site, albeit there would be some loss on that, which would be obviously be mitigated as part of any future planning application.
And what would the mitigation entail?
Replacement of loss and incorporation of other features on the site. Obviously, at this stage, it's only a master planning exercise which has been undertaken, and all that detail will be informed by the retained ecologist on the site, and who's been working on this for quite a while.
Right. Okay. Have the council got anything to add on this particular point, or go to other participants? Mr. Cross.
Sorry, sir. No, I'm content.
No, and obviously, again, I think we touched on this this yesterday. Is obviously it is within the landscape character area. Again, obviously the adverse impacts on that, and how those would be sort of mitigated in terms of the overall effect.
Yes, sir. Again, as I say, the assessment basically notes that the landscape character assessment report, which basically given its name, characterised the landscapes in the borough. It didn't have a particularly high sort of like scoring criteria in that report. It did identify some areas that were maybe at risk and could do with some enhancement or protection. Obviously, as I say, in terms of looking at the matter in the round, we do have to identify land for development, and unfortunately that does mean the loss of some features, and some features that may have slightly higher value. We feel that the approach is appropriate. We did at an earlier session cover the core biodiversity areas, and it was agreed that the council would identify those on the policies map, and we're working with the colleagues at MEAS to prepare that for you.
Okay, yep. So those obviously are part of our discussion, on the ecological area. So they will be fully identified, the areas in relation to W4 and W5 as well. So, yeah, thank you. Okay, so Mr. Harper, please.
Thank you, sir. Mr. O'Connor mentioned that hedgerows and trees would be retained. I think you yourself mentioned that there was extensive woodland in W4, which is true. But the only response was to do with Queensbury Road, which was W5. What's the stance on W4 with regard to the extensive woodland that is currently there?
Mr. O'Connor, do you want to just come back? I think you confirmed that that would be retained as part of the planning.
So yeah, as I set out, as much of the existing features on site would be sought to be incorporated as part of the master plan for the wider area. So the trees in question that Mr. Harper has raised, it's likely that they would be retained as part of the master plan for the wider site.
And obviously the added protection that Mr. Cross said, obviously in terms of the biodiversity action area, basically that would obviously be factored in terms of obviously ensuring that mitigation is taken into account. Is that correct in terms of the relevant policies from the plan would speak to it? So obviously full ecological surveys would obviously, which I know I understand what you've commented on so far. There has been an element undertaken already in relation to the site. But they've sort of identified mitigation measures already. Is that right? As part of the
yes, there's a retained ecology consultant appointed on this site who's been undertaking regular surveys, which will obviously are informed of planning application. But any additional policies which come out of these sessions and the policies map would also be factored in as part of any future application on the site.
And is that ecological surveys, is that part of the actual submissions? Just to be, if you could direct me, I think it's part of.
I'd need to double check. I'm not sure we have formally submitted any of the ecological work that was undertaken. It was more just to inform Taylor Wimpey's understanding of the site and to ensure that surveys were undertaken at the right time in the event that we want to prepare an application towards the back end of this year, for instance, outside of season, just so we didn't miss the window of opportunity.
Okay, yeah, because I think your submission mentions them. I think in a summary form. I think the technical evaluations of those particular areas. So at this stage, it's been the basic technical evaluations is covered, but not as part of your submissions at this stage.
Yeah, but if that was required, I'm sure we could submit that.
Thank you very much. Right, I think in terms of the those aspects, unless anybody else wants to raise further, we're just going to move on to the highways issues, if I could please. So obviously the impact on the local highway network, I think, basically looking at the council submissions, and obviously those are the submissions, the local plan transport study basically indicates that by 2035 there could be some overcapacity on localised roads. I think the particular one that was mentioned, I think, is related. It's Cronton Lane and Birchfield Road, which I think is to the east of the site. Could obviously the council just address those issues, whether those would be catered for in terms of localised improvements in terms of this particular site?
Yes, thank you, sir. As you say, the sites were assessed as part of the overall update of the Liverpool City Region traffic model, and you have that documentation in front of you. We believe that document didn't identify any potential issues over and above what would be normally expected to be dealt with through the development control process. However, I'm sure my colleague Jonathan Farmer could provide you with some more technical details or response to more technical questions should you require it.
Yeah, Mr. Farmer, if you just could give me your overview, basically the assessment of highways localised impacts from the developments W4 and W5 here in northwest Widnes on the road network, and how whether those can be catered for.
Thank you, sir. Yes, as has already been mentioned, some link capacity has been flagged up as an issue at the Cronton Junction, particularly on the junction approaches. There's a small amount of overcapacity which we are aware of as we've looked at other allocations in this area. However, there are improvements and sufficient highway space available in that area that have been identified, which will enable improvements to capacity at that junction location, particularly Norlands Lane and Birchfield Road, known locally as the Black Horse Roundabout. In terms of other locations, there isn't anything particularly nearby the site. You've got quite modern infrastructure in that place with the new Queensbury Way Distributor Road, as was mentioned earlier, and it's envisaged that the majority of the traffic from sites W4 and W5 would be directed via new access onto Queensbury Way, that Distributor Road, which was purposely designed for the development in Upton Rocks. I don't think I've got anything more to add. There possibly may be a small amount of traffic onto Chapel Lane, but it's recognised that Chapel Lane is less suitable as the major access for the development. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. If we just ask Mr. O'Connor's just comments really on this particular point in terms of any modelling work they've been doing as a developer and how that.
Yeah, so Taylor Wimpey have appointed a transport consultant a number of years ago on this site who's been advising on it, and I understand they've had discussions with the council's officer already about the wider area. They've looked at some of the local junctions to this site and have identified that if mitigation is required, that the appropriate mitigation can be delivered on public highway land to accommodate the development. So we're not anticipating any significant issues on transport, similar to what Mr. Farmer said.
And they indicated in terms of access arrangements, has there been any early work done in terms of where the specific primary and secondary accesses would be?
No, we haven't got into that level of detail as of yet. We're just more looking at the local infrastructure around the site rather than actually specifics of the site that would evolve in the planning application.
Right, okay. Mr. Thomas?
Yes, I just wanted to ask a question about the impact on Sandy Lane of the development, because Sandy Lane obviously splits these two parcels of land, and there must be some impact on it, I guess, from the development and the egress and ingress to the side. That's one point. And the other point is that, have you taken into consideration the impact of the cycle path which is proposed to come from Huyton via Knowsley down to Halton, which will go down Sandy Lane, in fact?
Okay, Mr. Cross, or
perhaps I could deal with that one. So the plan quite clearly shows that Sandy Lane is intended, it's identified as a greenway. So it's not trafficked as a pedestrian route. I'm sure Mr. Farmer will probably correct me and tell me it's a bridle way or something as well. The intention is that that feature will be retained within the development. Obviously, there will have to be road access across the Sandy Lane within the site, but we don't see that prejudices its function as a greenway or as a cycle link.
And the wider, just whilst Mr. Thomas has commented on the wider network, basically in terms of that would be quite useful just to touch on that at this stage in terms of footways and obviously cycleways. I think obviously he's mentioned the wider cycleway. Yeah, Mr. Farmer. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Yes, we're dealing with a scheme at the moment, as Mr. Thomas mentioned, Prescott to Widnes cycleway scheme. It does use Sandy Lane through the site, and there is proposed crossing improvements on Queensbury Way, which would remain in place, and then the route carries on then along towards Victoria Park in Widnes. We don't see that the route, apart from the road crossings that are inevitable that Mr. Cross mentioned, that it would have a large impact on the route, and we would work with the developer obviously to make sure that route is still delivers its desired outcomes. So.
Thank you. Just bring Mr. Connor in there, and also if I could just touch on obviously how the development intends to retain the need for Sandy Lane as a greenway network, and also obviously when I was on site, obviously there's obviously footpaths. Obviously, particularly reading towards Chapel Lane, there's quite how those would be dealt with basically as part of an overall development basically, and in terms of the wider network that obviously would go further towards Crompton, really how those would be addressed.
Yeah, the intention is that the existing public rights of way and Sandy Lane would be retained and enhanced as part of the master plan for the overall site. And incorporated within that. And as Mr. Cross and Mr. Farmer indicated, there would be crossings of Sandy Lane required, but the intention is not to use Sandy Lane as an access for the site or anything like that.
No, it'd just be retained effectively as a public cycleway, etc. As part of the actual overall scheme, and that would be retained as an integral part of the development. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's seen as a key feature of the site in terms of retaining that and retaining its importance as well.
Right, and is that seen as a benefit, as in terms of obviously issues we've obviously talked about the green belt issues, but is that seen as a benefit then effectively of the overall development?
Yes, it certainly is, and obviously with Mr. Farmer we spoke about highway improvements focused on cars, but there's also a lot of work being undertaken in relation to pedestrian and cycle linkages back into Widnes as well and further afield.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Harper?
It's Colleen.
Yeah.
It seemed to be almost a good thing that there's a bit of an issue at the Northern Lane Birchfield Road junction. This is an enormous issue for those of us who live here already, and I just don't comprehend how, looking at that junction, I don't know whether, Mr. Troy, you know the circumstances of it specifically, but it's a very, very tight junction, and you're going to have another 450 houses there, plus all the ones in the northeastern part of Widnes, and they're all going to be accessing that same junction. A lot of people will be wanting to go up Wilmere Lane, and I just can't see how you can deal with that with that junction at the moment. So I'd be interested in what plans are being considered to mitigate the problem.
Could I ask that whether there's a contribution coming in from the developer towards improving that junction as well, please?
Mr. Farmer, I know you've sort of touched on the junction improvements basically by Birchfield Road and Cronton Lane. Is the basically obviously you've obviously indicated those would be part of the actual potential wider proposals for improving this area. Do you see that there's issues related to that, and what improvements have you got? Any improvements at this stage that are in mind, and obviously whether you foresee contributions coming from this particular site? Mr. Farmer.
Yes, thank you, sir. Yes, I mean, I appreciate that this junction is an area of concern, particularly with the shops in the local area and a lot of movements around the college. We have looked at the junction. It's in the transport infrastructure pipeline plan going forward as part of the scheme that was talked about earlier with the cycle routes. It's being looked at from a multimodal perspective. So looking at it as part of the cycle route, crossing points for all modes. And then from a highway capacity point of view, it's still early days in terms of the development. But in recent years, we have had developers of the Norland Lane sites look at the junction, particularly the Norlands Lane junction, and put forward different types of junction arrangements which we know can cope with additional amounts of traffic if those were implemented. It would require quite a substantial redesign around the junction in terms of traffic movements, whereas it's fairly free with roundabouts at the moment. And then that would need to be put in place. We do envisage that, similar to what's been looked at previously, we would carry on seeking appropriate Section 106 contributions towards those junction improvements.
Okay, so those would obviously apply to any developments within the area that would affect obviously that particular development, including potentially the sites here at North West Widnes as well. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. Okay, thank you. If that's in terms of discussion on the localised network, obviously we touched yesterday on the strategic road network, and I just basically wanted to see whether the comments that applied, the Highway England's concerns regarding the impact on Junction 7 at the M62, whether the comments that were applied yesterday obviously apply for this particular site as well. That those discussions have been undertaken and additional work is envisaged. That's, I think, factored in, I understand, into the infrastructure development plan. I think there was discussion on that yesterday. I would assume does the same apply in this case, Mr. Scott?
That's correct, sir.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Okay, if there's nothing further to raise at this stage on the highways, I was intending probably to take a short break if I could until about 20 past 11, and then I'll move on to just the infrastructure issues after the break. So if we could just take a break, a screen break and a short break now until about 20 past 11, and we'll re-adjourn then. So thank you very much. Okay, it's 20 past 11. Hopefully everybody can hear me. So we're just going to move on to the infrastructure requirements cost base in relation to the sites in northwest Widnes. If the council could just give me an overview, basically what they see as the infrastructure requirements and costs and how they would be addressed in relation to sites W4 and W5. Thank you.
Again, thank you, sir. Obviously, as mentioned yesterday, all the sites were assessed or included within the whole plan viability assessment. It concluded that sites of this nature are viable and deliverable within the plan period. In terms of specific infrastructure required for this site, we haven't identified, other than, I say, potential for some off-site highway improvements, I say, in line with normal development control practices. We haven't identified any additional infrastructure requirements specific to the delivery of this site.
Okay. Okay, can I just ask the council's view, the developer's view on the those particular issues, please?
Yes, we concur with what Mr. Cross has just said, and that's our understanding following our assessment of the site as well. We don't envisage there to be anything else that's required at this stage.
Okay, fine. Okay, and just so Mr. Cross, we discussed at quite detailed length the issue relating the discussions on education, primary and secondary schools in Widnes. Is basically the discussions the same applied today in terms of sufficient primary and secondary school capacity in Widnes, so a contribution won't be sought? Is that presumably the position is the same in relation to the sites here in northwest Widnes? I just wanted to be sure, and also if you just cover the issues relating to health as well, health services as well. I think you mentioned up to ROCs, the GP surgeries to be there's due to be work undertaken there as well.
Yes, thank you, sir. For the benefit of the people that weren't present yesterday, the issue of education requirements was discussed. We made reference to the appendix to the Council's Matter Statement 12, which includes data from the latest EduBase figures from government. Effectively, it shows the capacities and the skills within Halton and the current pupil roll, and identified that there is sufficient capacity within the existing employer education estate to accommodate pupils from Widnes. We also made reference to the latest population projections as set out in our latest AMR document, which shows that the population, particularly of primary school age children, is projected to fall over the plan period. In terms of secondary school children, there is a spike going through the system at the moment, so the numbers of secondary school pupils is expected to rise until, I believe, 2025 or thereabouts, after which it will start to fall back to levels similar to today. So we believe that there is sufficient capacity within the existing education stock to accommodate potential pupil numbers. Where we do have, if localised shortfalls are identified, occasionally say our school place planning team say they can usually be accommodated by the addition of additional classrooms on existing sites. We're not looking at new sites in order to support the level of development across North Widnes, and at present we're not looking for contributions towards additional classrooms at this time. In terms of health provision, there was obviously, the standard, the fairly common concern about the availability of appointments for health facilities, which I say we're not underplaying or dismissing those concerns. However, I say where a need is identified by our health colleagues, we do work actively with them in order to facilitate the provision of new facilities. We gave a couple of examples, one being the new facility as part of the redevelopment of the Castlefields area in Runcorn, and we also made reference to the proposals for a new GP surgery or a relocated GP surgery enhanced provision, which is to be located in the Upton Rocks local centre, and hopefully that will materialise over a very short-term period within the next couple of years.
Okay, thank you for that summary. Mr. or Mrs. Harper?
Thank you, Mr. Choi. 2 points, first of all, with regard to the schools. How many of the children who might live in the W4 and W5 do you expect will have to be sent to school in Cronton, or in fact asked by their parents to go to school in Cronton? Has there been any negotiation with Cronton with regard to Cronton Primary School? Because if these go ahead, you'll have a huge area of Upton Rocks with no primary school provision of its own whatsoever. And I'm sure a lot of the parents, because Cronton I know has a very good educational report, and a lot of the parents will want to send their children there. Has there been any negotiation with Cronton about housing some of the children there? And then with regard to the health, as you mentioned yesterday, the medical centre that's being built in Upton Rocks is actually a transfer of Appleton surgery. Has any calculation been done with regard to the capacity? Because you're going to be presumably transferring Appleton patients there already, as well as all the new housing estates that you're planning for North East and North West Widnes. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cross, I'll just get you to come back on those points regarding Cronton, obviously primary school there, and also just the point there relating to capacity at the new enhanced surgery at Upton Rocks. Thank you.
I'm not aware of the discussions that may or may not have taken place between our education place planning colleagues and their opposite numbers in surrounding authorities. As we did mention, I say a number of the schools, particularly in Halton, have academy status and are not in the control of the Borough Council. We also repeated the information that we've been supplied by our school place planning colleagues that no pupil in Widnes, in Halton, did not get one of the first three choices. If parents choose to select schools outside of the borough because they have a particularly good reputation and are located in close proximity, I'm sure that may happen. But I say I'm not aware of the selection criteria or the catchment area for the primary school in Cronton. I say that will be a matter for them. In terms of the health provision, yes, I say we were quite clear yesterday that it was a relocation of facilities, but my colleague Mr. Plant did point out that it was to a more modern facility. If he's party to information in terms of the overall capacity and the number of doctors or whatever, perhaps he could chip in. But I say I don't have that information immediately to hand. I'm sorry.
Mr. Plant, have you got anything further to add on that point at this stage?
Not on the capacities for the health centre, as Mr. Cross mentioned. It's a relocation. It is a more modern facility in terms of size. It is bigger, but I don't know in terms of GP numbers or capacity. Okay,
thank you, Mr. Thomas.
Yes, just to make a point about the two schools. There are two schools in Cronton Village, and as far as I'm aware, and we obviously have close connections with the with both schools. They are both full.
Okay, thank you. And that, just Mr. Cross, that information will be reflected, I guess, in the education school place planning data. I think is that correct in terms of just the current position in terms of Cronton, the primary school, the schools there at Cronton?
I'm sure they take it into account. So obviously, our school place planning colleagues are very well aware of the development going on in the borough. They're aware of the proposals in the local plan. I think their planning time horizons are slightly shorter in terms of looking forward. I think they have a slightly longer term planning for secondary schools. And a slightly shorter time frame for primary schools. But as I say, at no point have they raised concerns about the shortage or potential shortage of capacity within the borough. In fact, I would probably go as far to say they're quite strident in their position regarding them taking the opposite position, that there is sufficient capacity as evidenced by the edge-based data within the system.
Okay, Mr. Harper.
Thank you. I'd just like to point out that in the regional master plan for the Birchfield development, which is thousands of homes, there was space for a primary school, which subsequently was turned into housing. So there isn't a primary school in Birchfield or that area, and that's why we're particularly talking about Cronton, which is in close proximity. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Okay, could I just in terms of the infrastructure again, I think you touched on it just earlier regarding just accessibility, is ensuring the satisfactory connectivity and accessibility to local service and facilities. Just in terms of sustainable transport from this particular site, just could you confirm, obviously, that the bus service, there is a regular bus service to local town centres, either Widnes or elsewhere, please?
Yes, sir, I'm advised that the number 26 is a circular, it's a Widnes circular service, and I believe the number 7 is the Warrington to Liverpool service, providing direct services. The site is also located within not very close proximity, but it is located in reasonable proximity to Widnes train station.
Okay. Mr. O'Connor, have you got any comments to make on this particular point, please?
Nothing further to add from our perspective.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Harper.
Yes, partly covered the item yesterday with regards to the planning area for houses within these areas and how wide the roads are, etc. And Mr. Cross assured us that, or rather Mr. Peake assured us that the roads would all be wide enough to take 2 cars passing safely, and that there would be a pavement down at least one side of every road for safe channels by pedestrians. It would be nice if the developers could confirm that they've all been taken into consideration as part of their master plan. But also, I would like to suggest, because of the size of these housing estates and the distance to bus stops, I notice in some areas, such as in Warrington, new estates have been made, the roads have been made wide enough for a little runaround bus to go around the estates. Is there any plan for such types of things in these new estates in Halton?
Could I get someone from the council just to, I know we talked about highway standards and road widths yesterday in terms of what would be applied to new development. If you just could confirm that, and obviously accessibility to new estates. So regarding public transport, as Mrs. Harper's just requested some information on there. Mr. Farmer, thank you.
Thank you, sir. Yes, I mean the new estate roads are designed appropriately, as was mentioned by my colleague Mr. Peake yesterday. Usually a 4.8 metre minimum width on the smallest roads, going all the way up to 6.75 potentially to allow for bus access We would obviously consider at the time of the planning application what bus services are in place, whether that's appropriate to serve the development, and then we would need to work on the planning of the development accordingly to accommodate which transport movements it needs to cater for, looking at the policies on bus services. It probably is a little bit more unusual for a development of this scale to have accessibility, particularly, as Mrs. Harper says, for a large bus. I think the situation there is that we're considering smaller buses in that sort of case. The difficulty with smaller buses is having to support a service which moves in more locally. Usually the reliance, if we can, is upon commercial services on the major roads. That probably partly answers the question, perhaps not fully. Thank you.
Okay. The developers got anything further, Mr. O'Connor? Have you got anything further to add on this in terms of design? Would you?
Only that it's our intention that we'd engage in pre-application discussions with the council's planning officers and highways team in advance of a planning application being prepared. So all this information and detail can be trashed out in advance of the planning application being submitted. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Okay. Is there any other infrastructure issues that basically I just need to pick up on in terms of Northwest Widnes? Anything that might be in the infrastructure development plan that might be relevant to this particular site, Mr. Cross, that you haven't already picked up on?
No, I don't believe so, sir.
Okay. And just in terms of just moving on to the next question relating to mechanisms for basically ensuring there's a comprehensive and coordinated approach to developments, ensuring the infrastructure requirements are provided for on this and obviously any other sites. Do you think that those mechanisms are in place in relation to the sites in Northwest Widnes? Would also the plan-wide approach that you've got in terms of the approach be appropriate or more specific site criteria or development principles required to guide this development?
Thank you, sir. Again, yes, the council believes that the application of the plan-wide policies are appropriate in this circumstance. As obviously before you, that both sites are in the control of the same developer. So it's obviously in their interest not to sterilise one part of the site by their arrangements on the other. As was intimated, I believe, by Mr. Farmer, the principal access to the development, the whole development as a whole, which should be from Queensberry Way. He said with only a limited number of properties appropriately accessed from Chapel Lane. So the site will need to be brought forward in a comprehensive manner to ensure that all parts of the site can be serviced in highway terms from Queensberry Way. Other than that, I say in terms of the overall scale, I say there's not raised any particular, there's no particular infrastructure requirements other than the internal arrangements of the site that would warrant a site-specific policy in this particular instance.
Okay, can I get just the, again, Mr. O'Connor's view, just from the developer's perspective in terms of this particular question, whether the plan-wide approach is effective in terms of trying to coordinate the comprehensive development of this site, or do you think more site-specific criteria or development principles are required?
From our opinion, we're satisfied that the approach taken by the council is appropriate in this instance and can deliver the development set out in the plan.
Okay, thank you. If there's no other points to raise on this particular question, I'm just going to move. I don't think I'm aware of any modifications in relation to the policy or the site allocation in this instance, Mr. Cross. No, okay, thank you. If that's the case, I'm just going to move on to viability and deliverability. So I'm going to start with the question of viability relating to the sites W4 and W5 in Northwest Widnes, and then we'll talk about the delivery of the sites. I'll just talk a bit more in a short time about how that can be framed. So just the question really in terms of starting with the viability. Do the council consider that the proposed developments W4 and W5 are viable in this particular instance?
Thank you, sir. Possibly touching on both parts of your questions. Let's say the assessment of the site didn't identify any particular adverse restrictions or any problems to the development of the site. We did identify, say, obviously, as you picked up yourself, the presence of the lowland deciduous woodland in the neighbourhood and the nature improvement area. As has been discussed, I think, in relation to a couple of sites, a very small portion of potentially contaminated land, which again, pretty much in terms of some of the other sites we assume is there was presence of ponds on the site at some point in history that have been infilled. So we don't think there's abnormal costs associated with the development of this site. We don't have any particular infrastructure asks of the site, and the viability study concluded that sites of this nature are viable and are deliverable, and I don't believe you have any information in front of you from third parties to challenge that assessment.
Just in terms of, again, I think we touched upon it yesterday about the plan-wide viability for the strategic site, showing sort of marginal viability. Is that basically, again, if the development of these sites in individual parcels, is that likely to lead to a higher viability in this particular instance? Obviously, it's that question really regarding how it might be developed.
Sorry, sir, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the output from the plan-wide viability indicated that some of the strategic sites, the larger sites, there was marginal viability. I think it's mainly built on the fact that I think there's probably higher infrastructure costs. Would obviously the issue really in relation to this site is whether that viability is a question that would be would need to be addressed, or do you think the individual development of this particular site would obviously lead to a higher level of viability?
Oh, sorry. Yes, thank you, sir. Obviously, as I say, in terms of our overall assessment, in terms of the developable area, for sites above 5 hectares, we assume 70% developable, and that informed our notional capacity. Obviously, the more detailed work undertaken by Mr. Connor's colleagues has indicated that level of capacity is deliverable. In fact, they think they could possibly achieve slightly higher capacity on the site. So that would suggest that the viability calculations were based on a reasonable assumption in terms of the potential output on the site. And I would say that would strengthen the conclusions that this site is viable and deliverable.
Okay, Mr. O'Connor, just from the developer perspective, you just answered the same question really in terms of the viability of this site and any obviously supporting work that you've come to play that Mr. Cross had just mentioned.
Yeah, on the plan-wide viability, obviously we had a long discussion in earlier hearing sessions on that, and I think we were advocating that a tweak was made to the proposed affordable housing mix, and we weren't kind of raising any other substantive issues in terms of plan-wide viability, but from the site-specific perspective, following the detailed analysis we've undertaken of the site itself and following discussions with the council and what we've heard today, we're not envisaging that there'd been any significant site-specific issues in terms of viability.
Okay, thank you. Right, is there any other points to raise on the viability before I just move on to the delivery of the actual sites? I think just for those that weren't present yesterday, I think the majority of people were, we just asked the council to set out basically in a table for us for each site we're going through, basically basically the council's view on the deliverability of the site, and also and a separate table showing the actual developer's view. So there's certain questions which will benefit in our discussions, particularly on the housing land supply on matter 17. So we're just trying to get a clear picture on the questions that we raised. Yes, and we'll raise in future hearing sessions over the next 2 weeks. So I'm just going to go through just a series of questions really, and just to say obviously the discussion doesn't prejudice our views as inspectors on the consideration of the overall plan on these individual sites. It's really just to provide the detail to complete our picture whilst we're actually discussing these specific sites, so it doesn't prejudice our consideration of these sites or the sites overall. So just in terms of just the in terms of W4, site W4, the site between Old Upton Road and Chapel Lane, I mean, they may well be taken together, because I understand the developer's Taylor Wimpey. Is that correct in terms of the from the submissions I've got so far? Mr. Cross and Mr. O'Connor.
Yes, I believe they say that both sites are under the control of Taylor Wimpey. Will be brought forward by them as essentially the principal developer. I should just make a slight apology or a slight correction to the matter statement under 12B11. We basically set out the assumptions from the SLA. This effectively shows the the changeover between the previous SLA, which was treating these individual parcels that identified a number of individual parcels within particularly W4 and 3 individual parcels within W5. Treated those as individual parcels and showed them as not available because they're currently within the green belt. So in terms of the assumed lead-in time and the assumed build rates, it treated them as small and medium sites individually. And so if you were to tot those up, it's effectively saying that we would be delivering several, potentially a couple of hundred units per annum on site, which is clearly not the case. In the tables that we said we would produce for you yesterday, we have supplied the first draft to the programme officer this morning, which you've probably not had a chance to see. We have amalgamated the sites into W4 and into W5, and the standard assumptions that would be used within the SLA, as set out in our Matter 17 statement, is that on large sites, without planning permission, we assume an 8-year lead-in time for generating units, and we would assume a build rate of 50 units per annum. So across taking the 2 sites as a whole, 431 units, that would suggest a build out of 8 years.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Connor, if I just could ask yourself really, what the questions we're trying to obtain information really about the lead-in time to these, obviously the particular proposals in this instance on W4, W5, whether there was any timescales for marketing, what the timescales might be for submission of an application, whether it be outline or full, and then leading to that, what the timescales would be for a start on site, including any preparation time. So, if just bearing those in mind, if you could just give us some idea of basically what your take is on this, please.
Yeah, no problem. As I mentioned earlier, Taylor Wimpey, the developer, is undertaking various surveys behind the scenes, just ensuring that once the plan does get adopted, that we're in a position to prepare a planning application. That is our intention, and it's likely that once there's a degree of certainty that the plan will be adopted, then we will commence pre-application discussions with the council in relation to the site. So on the assumption that the plan can be adopted by the end of 2021, we've set out a timetable for preparing the application, submitting it, and getting it to determination by the end of 2022. And then commencement on the discharge conditions, commencement on site summer 2023, with first legal completion likely to be early 2024. So that's just our general assumptions at this stage obviously is predicated on the adoption of the plan and releasing the land from the greenbelt. And then in terms of delivery, we're anticipating we've applied a cautious approach of 45 dwellings per year.
Okay. Can I just ask, in terms of just that start date, the lead-in time there, are you saying that the start would be in 2024, early 2024, or would it be 2023? Just in terms of your best estimates.
Best estimates, if we secured approval at the end of 2022, 6 months. I've applied 6 months for discharging conditions and mobilising and getting on site. So summer 2023 to get on site, start putting in access and various other pieces of infrastructure with the first legal completion in early 2024. Okay.
And in terms of full, obviously you mentioned 45 dwellings. Obviously, I think the council mentioned 50. So basically, would that be effectively from basically 2024 onwards, the first completions? That would be a full year effectively from there onwards. Is that what you're saying? Basically, 45 dwellings effectively. What we're trying to ascertain is whether there's going to be any completions really in 2023. So from there onwards, you're saying 2024. And what was the estimated basic completion? So basically 45 dwellings a year, effectively. Is that right?
That's as a cautious estimate. Obviously, we don't seem to be over-egging the potential delivery of the site. So as a cautious estimate based on what Taylor and Peter are experiencing elsewhere in the northwest, we've applied 45. Obviously, there'll be years where they may be delivered higher and conversely lower, depending on the market at the time.
Okay, thank you. And is there any other comments you want to make at this stage in terms of delivery, obviously, of this site? Any other comments?
I suppose the last question was in terms of what form of planning application it would be. I would envisage that it would be either a hybrid or a full. It's unlikely that we'd go down the outline route, given that it's an allocated site, or hopefully an allocated site. So there would be an element of a full, allowing development to commence sooner rather than later.
Okay, so what do you mean by hybrid? Sorry, this would be
so you'd have an element of a full application and an element of a hybrid. An element of an outline.
Right. Okay, and that would be, just to be clear, obviously, would you be envisaging basically submitting in parallel for sites DB4, DB5 for the entire site? Is that?
Yes. Yeah.
Time.
I've considered the site as a whole rather than individual parcels.
Okay, thank you. Okay.
For the purposes of your table, sir, can I just seek just one minor clarification or just one comfort? Obviously, we're dealing with two sites, and I say it's currently shown on the table as W4 and W5. I mean, as it's arithmetic, it's not it doesn't have any other implications. But I will apply the completions to W5 first. In the early years and W4 in the later years, so that it averages out to 45 dwellings per annum across the two sites. Is that basically acceptable? It's arithmetic. It doesn't have any particular effect, but it's just in terms of how I allocate the completions or potential completions to the two sites.
Mr. O'Connor?
Yeah, that's fine with me. No comment on that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there any other comments that anybody wishes to make at this stage on delivery in relation to these sites? No, thank you very much. Okay, well, I've got no further questions to raise at this particular point on strategic allocations, SRL8, DB4, DB5 in Northwest Widnes. If there isn't any further questions at this stage, we are going to move on to the next item on the agenda, which obviously is safeguarded land at SG10 Pexhill. So I'm going to hand over to Mrs. Malloy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Troy. Just to double check, obviously Mr. Troy's made good progress this morning. Are participants happy to carry on and see how far we get before lunch? Brilliant, thank you. Right, just moving on now then to matter 16, and in particular safeguarded site SG10 at Pexhill, Widnes. Just a point of clarification, really, before we get into the discussion, in relation to the smaller parcel of land, site ref 137, and what the land ownership issue there is. It's obviously out with the broader land holdings of Norlands Farm. Is that something either Mr. Cross or one of the developers can clarify for me?
I think we defer to the developer.
Ms. McGrath.
Hi, yes, just to confirm, it's not within my client's ownership. We understand it's a private ownership, and that is as much as we know from a land registry search. It's a small parcel of the overall safeguarded allocation.
Okay, thank you. We'll come back to that parcel in terms of deliverability later on in the discussion. But just, Mr. Cross, if you could kick off by just setting out the background to the safeguarded land. How is it identified and which options were considered, please?
Thank you. I think we touched on part of this earlier this morning. Effectively, the council at the publication stage plan was a proposal for 466 dwellings per annum. That plan looked at identifying sufficient land to meet that policy requirement. That identified a number of sites as potential housing allocations. In the proposed submission draft plan, we've had the introduction of the standard method and the revisiting of the housing requirement, and it's concluded that the council concluded that policy figure of 350 was appropriate, and that obviously has a knock-on effect on the amount of land that is required to be released from the green belt in order to meet the development requirements of Widnes. As part of that, the council revisited the proposed allocations and the proposed safeguarded sites. A number of previously proposed safeguarded sites were discarded or abandoned and basically now recommended to be retained as green belt. And a number of the previously proposed housing allocation sites were, to use the phrase, downgraded to safeguarded land, which again is land that we are proposing to remove from the green belt in order to meet potential future housing or other development requirements should a future review of the plan determine that that's required. The sites in North Widnes that have been downgraded to safeguarded land are, the site to the back of Norcutt's Garden Centre, which was discussed yesterday, and the site SG10, formerly W6 at Peck's Hill. As was mentioned again previously, there was an additional site brought back into the mix in North Widnes, which was W49. That had been an area that had originally been recommended for allocation for housing, but members had felt unable to support it at that time. Members, in the latest iteration of the plan, have felt able to support a lower allocation of land in that locality, and that's the site in front of you today.
Okay, thank you. And what particular factors informed the council's decision to take a step back and, in your words, sort of downgrade the site to safeguarded land?
Effectively, I say the overriding issue was the proposed reduction in the overall housing requirement. So the amount of land that we require the additional land that we require to find from the greenbelt to meet development needs. Effectively, with the downgrade, with the reduction in the overall housing requirement, basically we felt we couldn't justify the level of proposed greenbelt release in the earlier iteration of the plan. And so the sites were revisited, and I say a number of sites were returned. The proposed removal of the greenbelt was abandoned and they're reconfirmed as greenbelt. And a number of the proposed allocation sites have been revisited, and say a number of them have been downgraded to safeguarded land. Obviously, I say as yesterday's discussion, the fact that the council is proposing to remove these areas from the greenbelt for potential future requirements shows that the council does believe that they are deliverable in the long term. We think that they can be brought forward for development. We just don't feel that we require them at this time in order to meet the needs of this particular plan.
Okay, but what particular site-specific factors came into play in sort of downgrading this site compared to consideration of other sites, for example?
She knows what she's doing.
Yeah, she is.
I think we had to look at everything in the mix. So yes, we had regard to the findings of the Greenbelt study. We had regard to issues over deliverability. We had regards to issues over highways. This particular site, effectively, we believe it can be, a satisfactory access arrangement can be achieved. However, we don't believe that we've actually had the information put to us on how that will be achieved. The primary access is onto Cronton Lane. That would take note that it's opposite the college, and effectively, whilst we believe that a solution could be found, we don't believe that technical solutions have been presented to us in order to show how that can be delivered. The sites also, it appears to be in a couple of ownerships, and some of the other sites had house builders associated with them and seem to be further along the process. It's quite a marginal call. I say, obviously, by originally proposing it for housing and by retaining it as safeguarded land, the council is clearly stating that we do believe that development is possible. But I say, in the overall mix, we think that on balance, the other sites that were still retained or proposed for housing are better at this time, and hence the fact that this has been downgraded to safeguarded.
Were there any particular, we'll come on to the discussion in terms of the greenbelt, but were there any particular greenbelt factors that came into play in your decision to downgrade the site?
Again, this is, the gaps are an issue.
Yeah. I've got the transport.
Sorry, Mr. Cross.
No, that's it.
I think that there's obviously interference coming to play. Mrs. Harper, are you muted? Yes, you are muted. Let's just check if anybody else needs to be muted. No. We'll keep an eye on that, but just if participants can make sure that you are muted, because obviously there was a little bit of interference coming in there. Sorry, Mr. Cross, we'd like to continue.
Yep, sorry. As I say this site, as with W4 and 5, is in one of the narrower gaps of the greenbelt. So in terms of the greenbelt function, it's similar issues. So it's similar there. There are concerns. We did have, primarily, probably the issues that basically tipped the balance were the multiple ownerships, the access issues. We also had United Utilities raising concerns that they've reactivated the borehole at Peck's Hill as for residential or for water supply, for potable water, and they were raising concerns about development within, so close to the borehole within the safeguard. I'm sorry, I'm trying to think. There's the safeguarding zone for groundwater source protection zone. Sorry, I was trying to remember the phrase. And so United Utilities again raised concerns over development and the source protection zone so close to the borehole that's now been reactivated. So on balance, we felt that the other sites had a slightly stronger case, and so the site was downgraded.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cross. We will come on to the technical detail later on in the agenda, but I'm conscious that the developers are chomping at the bit to come into the discussion. Mr. Mitchell, I think you had your hand up first.
Thank you, Mark. Can I apologise for introducing this term downgraded into the examination? It's an awful word, but I struggled at the time. I think Mr. Cross has now adopted that one as well. I welcome much of what Mr. Cross has just said, actually, in terms of it being a very marginal call, and that development is possible. You know, we don't necessarily disagree with a lot of those baseline assessments that have been made in that regard. The concerns we have are at the point when the council realised it was looking for less land in its view. How was this sort of assessment of the best sites actually undertaken, and where's the evidence behind that? Mr. Cross used the terminology this morning, it's the least worst option in looking at some greenbelt and greenfield sites. And we would concur that generally you would look towards the best sites for development. Now, it is our client's case that this is the best site for development in North Widnes for a number of reasons. And I just wanted to pick that up because the evidence before you is in relation to EL003, the Greenbelt study, and EL069, the technical assessments paper. And I think that's important to look at because I read the council's examination statement a couple of times over the last week, and this is really the first time we've seen any view from the council as to that process of change, the downgrading change that we referred to. 16.4 of the council's examination statement states that SG10 was proposed as a residential allocation to Regulation 18. However, due to highways constraints, which were not immediately resolvable, the site was promoted as safeguarded. And I don't necessarily think the evidence supports what's written in the council's statement. We have to remember that, first of all, this was a site that has been allocated really from the inception of the plan until the 11th hour, and the council hadn't ever raised any previous concerns about highways being the determinative factor. I would also just perhaps note that at 16.13 of the council's statement, it does say that whilst the site has been safeguarded for development, the technical assessments and greenbelt assessments conclude that the sites are suitable for development. So the council in its own statement goes on to suggest that there isn't any technical concerns. We'd agree with that. We don't think there are, and there has been all that information submitted both from myself, my client's the option holder, Mrs. McGrath as the landowner as well. Now, we've talked a lot about the Greenbelt study, and Mr. O'Connor this morning referred to differences in those Greenbelt assessments in the North Widnes parcels. Our assessment talks about it being a moderate contribution, and is very, very similar to a lot of the other sites with a moderate contribution. We are, in relation to Crompton, some 690 metres away rather than the 500 that W04 and 05 are. Now, before Mr. Connor jumps on me at any reason, we've raised no objections in relation to his client site, and we're not going there. But I just want to flag it up in terms of this options, this reset and review process that the council undertook. In the back of the council's statement, there is an extract from EL69G, which is the technical assessment of the safeguarded land in question. I don't know whether you can find that, because I just do want to refer to these technical assessment documents in the evidence library, Mark. They're sort of quite cumbersome documents with page numbers and things, so it might be quite difficult to find. But in relation to our client site, reference 138, There's various sort of categories. You're familiar with it. The category that talks about physical constraints on the site are considered to be minor. The category that talks about access and connectivity, it says it's got satisfactory connectivity. And the category that talks about accessibility states the site is considered to have satisfactory accessibility. And obviously the Greenbelt one we mentioned, a moderate contribution. So we're moderate contribution, satisfactory access, satisfactory connectivity, and only minor physical concerns about the site. Now, what I wanted to do was cross-reference that, because this is all part of this options reassessment, with document EL69G. The North Widnes sites fall within the Farnworth ward and the Birchfield ward. And I think, as part of the assessment here, that you're missing a bit of information. I think it will be really helpful to you in making your decisions and understanding this process that the council's gone through, to have a comparative analysis of the allocations in North Widnes versus the safeguard land, having regard to document EL69. I think that's important, because when you look at those categories of Greenbelt, when you look at the categories of connectivity, and when you look at the categories of accessibility and physical constraints, the safeguarded site here outperforms all of the other allocations in North Widnes. I'll pause there. I can take you to those documents, Marm, and go through every one of those categories. That is part of our client's concern here about that comparative assessment. But I'll perhaps pause at this point for others to come in.
Okay, thank you. I will come back to Mr. Cross for review, but I shall let Mrs. McGrath come in before doing so.
Thank you. Again, just a couple of points of clarification on the review process, which I think myself and Mr. Mitchell just want to understand a little bit more. I take on board everything Mr. Cross has explained in the opening statement there. I suppose the point is that in terms of kind of the audit trail as to why the site was allocated and now safeguarded, it has only really been set out in writing in paragraph 16.4 of the council statement, and Mr. Mitchell alluded to that, that actually within that paragraph it only explains that the site isn't considered capable of being developed at this time due to highways constraints, rather than specifically referring to the housing number, whereas paragraph 16.5, which refers to safeguarded site SG12, does indeed make that distinction in terms of being downgraded because of the housing figure. So that was just the first point of clarification, or question rather. Secondly, just the point on ownerships, because Mr. Cross just raised a query in terms of the ownership of the site. It is obviously stipulated in our statement, but just to be very clear, my client owns the whole of the site. Mr. Mitchell's client has an option on parcel 1 of the site, which is stipulated in paragraph 1 of his statement. And just to be clear, paragraph 28 of Mr. Mitchell's statement may have an inaccuracy in it, because it does actually say that they are the landowner, and that's not quite right. And then finally was just the point on transportation constraints, which I'm sure we'll come on to in a bit more detail later on the agenda.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cross, we're sort of returning to this issue of the process by which the the judgment was made to step back from certain sites to safeguard them as opposed to allocate them. Clearly, your statement refers to just the highways issue, but from what you've said this morning, there are sort of a number of site-specific factors which have influenced your decision. But if you could just respond to Mr. Mitchell's point regarding the process that was sort of undertaken in this sort of comparative assessment, if you like, of sites.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. My colleagues are just pinging me some additional information. So just a point of correction. It's noted that we did raise the particular concerns regarding the access arrangements to the site and the proximity to the access to the college. And that was raised at a meeting on the 13th of March 2019 with a meeting with, if I've got down as Frank Marshall, Paul Johnson, the landowner. So I say this isn't something that's come out of the woodwork recently. This has been an issue that was identified by our highways colleagues and reported to the site promoters. In terms of the process, obviously, as I say, we are looking at we're proposing a lower housing requirement, and obviously the exceptional circumstances to warrant greenbelt release is less. The more greenbelt. If we're looking to release excessive amounts of greenbelt, over and above to meet the plan requirements with a period beyond, would not be justified. So I say the council has looked to minimise the take on the greenbelt overall. So we think that's the correct approach. And I say in terms of doing that, we have looked at the individual sites, and say we have considered the greenbelt study, we've considered sustainability, and we've considered deliverability. And say on this site, and say the fact that we are proposing it as safeguarded land is the fact that we originally proposed it for a housing allocation. The council's position is not that this site cannot be developed. We're just saying that the deliverability was more questionable at the time we were making the judgment than other sites. And it is a finally judged balance. But on that balance, the council concluded that safeguarded was the appropriate designation at this time.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Cross. And presumably there was an internal process, if you like, in terms of making that judgment at a planning officer level, but also presumably those sort of options were presented to, for example, a local plan working group or to members at some point of those deliberations.
Yes, obviously, yes, there was internal discussions within the department. There would have been discussions mentioned with particularly the portfolio holder. Between the two drafts of the plan, I would have to check the diary. I'm not sure there were local plan working parties. They had sort of fallen by the wayside a little bit, but obviously the plan was reported to committee, received approval from executive board, and was then passed up to full council, who approved the publication of the plan for a period of consultation and ultimately for submission to the Secretary of State.
Okay, thank you. And just sort of talk me through, if you like, the sort of process internally in terms of this comparative assessment between sites and how it was decided at an officer level, which sites to sort of downgrade. Sorry, that's going to stick now with us, isn't it, that term? But can you just sort of talk us through your thought process, if you like, in doing that comparative assessment? I think that possibly the criticism is that it's not there's not an audit trail, it's not documented, I suppose. But how was that dealt with, this comparative assessment?
Actually, I think the starting point is basically looking at the overall housing requirement, the overall land requirement. And I say, obviously, with the introduction of the standard method and trying to determine the appropriate housing requirement for the borough, that basically we came to the conclusion that the 466 figure, which was from the Mid-Mersey SMA, was no longer supportable, and that the council would move to a figure of 350 per annum. That obviously makes the land requirement significantly lower. So we did look and we see, well, the overall take. There were some urban sites, which green space sites, which I know you're going to come on to, that were previously proposed for development and received a lot of objection, and they were basically retained for green space. And then in terms of the potential, the currently greenbelt sites that we're looking to bring forward, again, we looked at the overall quantum, what was the minimum that we required in order to safely meet the identified development requirements for both Widnes and Runcorn. We then basically, some of the sites, to say, with the late change to the plan where the land that once East Road was taken out, a significant area was put in to Hale Bank, and say as part of the consultation on the publication draft, Natural England basically identified the need to undertake the overwintering bird survey to clarify the supporting habitat. And so again, some of the sites that were previously proposed to safeguarded or allocated are actually, identified as potentially being supporting habitat for the Ramsar site, again, suggesting that they should be retained as greenbelt. Obviously, as mentioned, members are supportive of a smaller allocation at Hunts Heath Road, and that site has been brought back in. And then I say we've looked at the overall requirement to see how many sites that we do require in order to try and minimise the land take and the green belt, both for this plan period and to give us a margin going forward. And you have had discussions previously about the level of safeguarded land proposed. And I say on balance, we've come to the conclusion that a couple of the sites are not needed in order to meet our development requirements in the current plan period. However, they may be required should circumstances change or in future plan periods.
Okay, thank you. Mr. and Mrs. Harper?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Mitchell is suggesting that there was a greater gap for this particular parcel of land compared to the ones we discussed earlier on today. But in fact, the gap remaining to Cronton is 370 metres according to the assessment. Very much, possibly even less than the ones we discussed, the parcels we discussed this morning. Also, the assessment in the Greenbelt assessment said it was an important area regarding the gap between settlements, and yet the assessment is moderate, which I don't understand. If it's got a major impact on that. Surely it's got a more than a moderate impact on the gaps, on the assessment. Sorry, and the allocation of this particular parcel of land would significantly decrease the gap between the settlements. I just wanted to make the point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Harper. We'll get on to the sort of contribution of the site to Greenbelt purposes in a moment. Mr. Mitchell, did you have any other comments in terms of the process?
Yeah, just one or two bits. As a clarification point for the record, I don't know who the council met. I don't know who Frank Marshall is back in March, but we'd made submissions right through the course of the local plan process, from inception and site submissions at the earliest stages, so the council did have our contact details on record there. For the plan to be found sound, the choice of sites has to be justified, and I accept that at the time the council was taking this review of the overall numbers that it needed, it went through a process, but I don't think we've got an audit trail on its selection of sites here. The evidence behind each site has not changed. If we go and have a look, and can I ask you to turn up EL069C, please, which is the Birchfield technical report on the site assessments.
Yeah.
This is the document that sets out the sort of high-level comparison, all the detail and the council's assessments of the site. It's done in parcelization, which doesn't make it ideal to read. But if you start at the top of this document and just as one example, scroll down to site 87, which is the top right corner of the document. It's about the sort of 5th or 6th page down. In the report, unfortunately, the PDF version doesn't have page numbers on. So it's the top right corner. You look for page 87, and these are the various parcels within W04. You see map reference W04 at the top. And when you go through this, and it's the same for site 87, site 88, site 89, site 90, the council's own assessment of these sites are that the accessibility and connectivity section is poor and needing to be improved. And this is the points I made about comparative information and evidence. When you actually look at what the council's own assessment is of W04, just an example, it performs worse than the Pexhill site. I just really wanted to make that point because I do think this Mr. McGrath's point about the audit trail and the justification for the choice of sites here, having regard to that change that was going on at the time, is missing in the context of the examination.
Mr. Cross, did you want to come back on that in particular relation to the assessments?
Yes, there's a number of points there. Obviously, as say, some of the sites, the larger sites, were assessed as individual parcels, and if you want to cherry pick parcels at the back of the site, then yes, they will identify poor access because it's dependent upon going across other parcels to achieve the access. If you're going to compare, so you're not comparing apples and pears, you need to basically restrict that to sites adjacent, the parcels adjacent to the highway network. In terms of having the contact details for Mr. Mitchell, yes, we do of course have his contact details, and I believe he was actually invited to the meeting that we referred to. My colleague says that she still has on file a copy of the invite. So yes, he was invited. In terms of access, I say in terms of the sustainability appraisal, the accessibility, as you can see from yourself from the documentation, it's mostly talking about the distances to various supporting facilities rather than whether or not a safe highways access can be achieved. As I say, we have mentioned that we have concerns about achieving a safe access onto Cronton Road. I've got a note from my colleague basically pointing out that the access onto Cronton, as shown on Ms. McGrath's document, is still not acceptable. There's too much conflict with the college that needs to be managed in another way, e.g. signalised roundabout, which would require the college to alter their access and needs further work. Can the other parties confirm whether or not they've actually had any discussions with the college in regards to achieving a satisfactory access to their site?
Mr. Mitchell, would you like to go first?
We've gone through a whole host of technical information over the years on this site, and obviously the council was purporting to allocate it at a previous stage as well, and therefore access and all those other matters would have been acceptable at those stages. I know Ms. McGrath has done the same, so we don't see that there is any technical concerns. Regarding the comment that Mr. Cross made about I've just cherry-picked one site as an example, I've not. I've just referred to that as an example, and I've suggested that in order for you to make a decision and look at the merits of the allocations in North Widnes, we do need that comparative example across all those parcels. The concerns relate to that technical assessment, which is the evidence base.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell too much further on this because we're going to get into the detail of things like highways as we go through the agenda. But Mr. Mitchell and Ms. McGrath, do you accept that there's an element of planning judgment that has to be applied in deciding which sites come forward.
Absolutely, I do, and I would accept and suggest that it's based on the council's evidence in EL69 and the assessments of the site. But the conclusions and the findings that Mr. Cross has reached in his choice of sites don't match what the evidence is telling us.
Ms. McGrath, would you like to unmute?
Sorry. Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I think it's more, again, it's the audit trail and how it's actually documented, particularly in writing. It was just really going back to the point of the council statement in paragraph 16.4. That's the first, I guess, paragraph which has been presented to us for the reasoning, really.
Okay, thank you. Mr. O'Connor.
Thank you, ma'am. Just coming back on one point. In relation to Mr. Mitchell's discussion on accessibility of sites, I just wanted to, obviously we've been consistent that we consider that W4, W5 should be considered as a group, so group G rather than looking at the individual parcels. And if you compare the accessibility of group G, which is set out in EL009, page 1235, the accessibility table for our site, and compare it with the accessibility table for the Hale site, which has been discussed, it's obvious that in accessibility terms, based on this methodology, our site is scores better than the Hale site. That was all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. O'Connor. Right, I'd like to move on now to back to the agenda again in terms of the findings of the Greenbelt review. Of the land in question. Mr. Cross, can you just briefly summarise the findings of the review in relation to purpose 1 in terms of the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas? And if you start with GBO21, the larger parcel, and then touch on the GBO20B, the smaller parcel, please. Thank you. I think we're all forgetting to unmute ourselves today, Mr. Cross.
Sorry, it's the joys of having too many screens, I'm afraid, hence the fact I'm always looking over there. I'm just, opening up the correct document. Sorry, you wanted me to talk specifically to the two sites? What were the two sites again? Sorry, it's just opening now.
Yeah, I think if you can focus firstly on the purpose 1 in terms of the checking the unrestricted sprawl and deal with the larger site parcel first, and then the smaller site parcel.
Sorry, I just lost the GB reference. Have you got the GB reference for me? I can quickly jump to it.
GB021 for the first land parcel and GB020B for the second.
Sorry, I was expecting this would be this afternoon. We moved forward a little bit quicker on the agenda compared to yesterday. Yes, thank you. So 21. Yep, sorry, I'm there now. So sorry, thank you for your patience. Effectively, I say that the site is partially contiguous to the urban area. It's obviously located in a narrow gap. Particularly to Cronton. Obviously, looking at the aerial photographs, you can probably see from the area that there is actually some intervening development between the majority of the site and Cronton, so it's possibly less visible to Cronton than W4 and W5. But that does have the corollary that the site is more constrained, more encroached by urban development. So the conclusion is that the site is largely contained.
And in terms of boundary strength, particularly to the north, that's determined that the boundary strength is weak on the northern edge.
The site feels very open to the north. There is a lane, a country lane, that does form part of the northern boundary, but if the boundary strength is assessed as moderate to weak.
Okay, and it's also identified that the boundary strength is weak on the east in terms of the sort of rear boundary treatment of the residential properties. And maybe more of a question for the developers, but how would that be addressed in terms of helping to strengthen those boundaries? Yes, Ms. McGrath.
I just refer to our vision document, which was submitted as an appendices to our hearing statement. That has got detailed information in terms of landscape views, ecology, and in relation to your specific question, in terms of how the boundaries could be facilitated. Again, we could that could all be dealt with through more detailed master plan or as part of a planning application. So I don't think it would be a showstopper for the actual site.
Thank you. Mr. Mitchell, anything to add?
No, I think that neatly sums it up. We'd agree that it's a contained site with very strong defensible boundaries, including the development on pretty much all sides, bar the northern side.
Okay, Mr. Cross, do you agree with the fact that that northern boundary could be strengthened through landscaping, for example?
Yes, I entirely concur with that, and obviously in terms of the illustrative master plans or the sketches that we've had put before us, I think the intention was that there would be a road, the secondary road access would pretty much have to follow the northern boundary along a reasonable part of its length, which could form the basis of creating a stronger boundary. In terms of the boundary assessments to the east of the site, obviously they're assessed as weak, but that's in terms of the existing boundary. So it's basically the residential back gardens currently performs as a weak boundary, which would become immaterial should this site come out of the green belt.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add in terms of the smaller site? So identified boundaries are generally weak and ill-defined. How would that be addressed?
Again, the smaller portion of the site is located to the east of the overall parcel. I say obviously if the development if the site's dealt with as a whole, then I say that wouldn't form part of the new greenbelt boundary. So the boundary strengths between the parcels and the internal to the site are immaterial.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add on purpose 1 in terms of unrestricted sprawl of built-up areas? No. Okay, just moving on to purpose 2 and preventing neighbouring towns from merging. Obviously, there's a bit of debate in terms of the gap between Widnes and Cronton and Widnes to Hale in terms of how wide that gap is. What did the assessment say on that point?
Again, I think it's the assessment will quote sort of meters, and it's been measured using a geographic information system. However, obviously, if you have reference to the area photography or the mapping associated with the sites, you can see that there is intervening development, houses with particularly large gardens on Peck's Hill, and the garden centre basically located between site SG10 and Cronton. So whilst it would result in the narrowing of the gap, it's slightly academic in that I say that there's already intervening built forum sitting within the green belt between this site and Cronton.
Okay, thank you. And just picking up Mr. Harper's point, I think is wanting to come into the discussion in terms of the relative size of the gap from this site to Cronton.
Is this for me? Sorry.
Yeah, Mr. Harper, you referred earlier to the fact that this site may actually be there might be sort of less of a gap, I think.
Yes, that's right. The houses that are on Pex Hill are part of Greenbelt already. The top section of the site, which is the one that sticks out right up to the road at up Pex Hill, is the one that particularly gets closest to Cronton and is measured at, according to the council site, at 370 metres, which is significantly less than the current gap. And in line with what we were talking about earlier in the other sites. The top sort of barrier now, the extent of Halton at the moment, because it pushes right to the top, is a pathway, well-used pathway at the top of Norlands Lane. So I'm not sure whether that's going to be a road then, or is it actually going to be still a path for people to walk along? As I say, it's a major path at the moment up to Pex Hill.
Mr. Cross, could you hear that okay?
I think I caught some of it. There's inquiring about the future status of the path, I'm assuming from Cronton Lane up to Pex Hill.
Yeah.
As I say, that's currently it's I think it's off like a farm track. I say that was assessed as being currently a weak boundary, but as mentioned, as part of the development of this site, it's indicatively showing the need for a second access along that route for the site. To support the number of houses potentially the site could support, so that would create a stronger boundary. And I'm assuming that yes, they would retain access of pedestrian access from Cronton Lane up to Pex Hill.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Thomas. Oh, sorry, Mr. Harper, did that address the concern?
No, actually, it's not Cronton Lane we're talking about, it's from Norlands Lane. And if you're talking about creating another access to this site along the top of the site that comes out onto Norlands Lane, you're then going to make the problem of the junction at Norlands Lane and Birchie Road even worse than it as planned previously.
And the other question was, if you're going to put a road at the top, are you going to maintain landscaping and a access for a pathway up to Pex Hill?
From Norlands Lane,
from
not
Norlands
Cronton
Lane,
Lane.
not Cronton Lane.
Sorry, I apologise. Yes, I meant Norlands Lane. My colleague John Farmer's just feverishly sending me messages to point out that the lane is currently a public right of way. The development is showing an access nearby, but not on it.
Okay, I think we'll come back to the sort of technicalities of the access later on in the agenda. Mr. Thomas, did you have a point?
Yes, I think I'd just like to support what Mr. Harper was saying earlier on about the gap between Cronton and Widnes again becoming very narrow. We feel attacked on all fronts at the moment. But if we were to choose between the two, I think we're much more concerned about the W4, W5 gap than we are about the Pex Hill gap, to be very frank and open with you. But we are concerned about these gaps, generally speaking.
Okay, thank you. But Mr. Cross, whilst there would be a narrowing of the gap, which is accepted by the council in terms of the area being very restrained, you do point out it would not lead to actual merging of towns as such.
Yes, again, the situation is the same here. And as I say, again, we just invite you to look at the map showing the bandings been contained within our Matter 12 statement. And you can clearly identify both the proposed allocations of W4 and W5, and also the extent of SG10. And let's say yes, probably the gap is narrower between SG10 and the edge of Cronton. However, as previously stated, there is intervening development between located within the green belt. So I'd say the impact is possibly lessened.
Mr. Thomas, is your hand left up there, or did you have a further point to make?
Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. I apologise.
No worries. We'll all do that at some point. Okay, and are there any other points in terms of the gap and merging of towns? No. Just moving on to purpose 3, in terms of safeguarding the countryside from encroachment. Mr. Cross, could you start off with the GB21, the larger parcel, please?
Again, the site is identified as being an agricultural use, so it probably scores quite well in terms of purpose 3. In terms of importance of retaining, importance of contribution to the green belt. I say the site is quite constrained on 3 sides by more urban type development. So we don't see that with the creation of a hard boundary to the northern edge. I say the development of the site shouldn't be problematic.
And in terms of the smaller parcel, sorry.
The smaller parcel is located at the back of the site. So again, if it was treated as a whole, it wouldn't have a similar impact if it's in similar use.
Okay, thank you. It's mentioned in the Greenbelt assessment in terms of the larger parcel that it would have a negative impact on the rounding of the Widnes settlement boundary, with the north and westernmost portions projecting into the Greenbelt towards Peck's Hill. Can you just elaborate on that point for me, please?
Yes, effectively, I say the rounding we basically looked at, as you would expect it, drawing lines between the various points of the settlement boundaries, where there was indents to see where if the proposed sites projected beyond, so that if you were stood at a particular point, or would the development on the parcel be perceived as basically just being part of the no more impactful than the existing settlement boundary, or if it would actually create a projection into the green belt. And you can see just again quite clearly from the map that the northwestern portion of the site does create a projection into the green belt. I say the effects of that are possibly different depending on where you stand. I say from Cronton there are some intervening developments, but if you were to stand to land to the north, and there are greenways located to the north, then the impact would potentially be significantly more noticeable.
And just coming back to our earlier discussion, was that a factor, sort of is flagged up as a negative factor, if you like, in the assessment? Was that a factor in taking a step back, for example, from the site?
It would have been in the mix. It would have been one of the things that was considered. To say whether it was the degree or weighting that was attributed to it, it would be difficult to say. But obviously, yes, it does create a projection.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of the contribution which the site makes at present to safeguarding countryside from encroachment, are there any points which the Mr. Mitchell, Miss McGrath wish to pick up on? You don't have to if you don't want to.
just an observation, really, that if the council was going through the process and was concerned about the northwest projection, I just wonder whether there was a thought whether that could have been rounded off in there or kept as open space. The site is contained by housing on, as Mr. Cross said, 3 sides, and the Pexhill Nature Reserve to the north western part of the site, which itself is a significant buffer in the concerns raised about coalescence with Cronton. But you could very easily round that off in that area, create some open space over there, and create a very nice development linking that in, really, if that was a particular concern.
Thank you, Mr. Cross. I'll put you on the spot. Is that something that that the council has considered?
From memory, I think it was probably something we may well have discussed with the site developers or site owners. Obviously, we said that the bottom portion of the site with the projection of the housing into the middle of the site presents less difficulties. The northern portion of the site is more open and more visible to the remaining green belt. It wasn't an option that they seemed keen to promote. And obviously, I say in terms of the overall housing numbers, I think what's been put to us is that the site should be considered as a whole, and they say there is the need to achieve a second, 2 accesses, and the preferred option or the only identified option for achieving the second access onto Norlands Lane is right at the north of the site. Otherwise, obviously, they'd be looking at removing existing housing and punching through, and that's not been an option that's been seriously put to us as on the table.
Okay, I'm just looking at the plan, and I don't know about anybody else, but I'm on Google Earth. There is some development to the north of that projection, isn't there, on site?
There's a development. There's a development known as Norlands Park, and I'm going to look to my colleague, Mr. Plant, who will remind me what was previously on that site. It was a site was approved for development within the green belt, but I believe it was a brownfield site, but I can't remember for the moment what the previous use was. It slightly predates my time, I think, at Halton.
What was the site called? Sorry, Norlands
Park.
Mr. Plant, is that something you can clarify?
Norlands Park was part of a grass drying plant, so it had quite a large sheds and a chimney on the site. And
Sorry, Mr. Plant, I missed the first part of that. It was part of the which?
A grass drying plant connected with the farm. I think it was all owned by the Cordwell family.
Okay, I'm sorry, what were you saying about that?
So it was an exception to Greenbelt policy. I think, again, it predates my time at Halton, but from my memory was allowed within development within the Greenbelt, I think, as a brownfield site, as Mr. Cross just mentioned, and then you've got the green buffer around that currently that screens it from the green belt. So that was formed as part of the development.
Okay, thank you. Mr. and Mrs. Harper, were you going to enlighten us on this site?
It was the grass factory. They used to make grass pellets, so they basically heated up grass and made pellets for animals, and it produced, every now and then they had a big sort of fire up the chimney and it dropped bits everywhere and it smelt if it was blowing in your direction. The smell was there all the time, just depending which direction the wind was blowing. Anyway, so the council, because it was in the green belt and it was part of the farm, and council agreed that it could be a development on green belt, but only on the footprints of the buildings that were there.
There were some of the fields roundabout were, I think, owned by the Caldwell family, and they used some of the grass that was grown there to make the pellets. But they were only allowed to actually develop the site, as Philip says, where the buildings were.
They used to collect grass from like airports, Liverpool Airport, Manchester Airport, that sort of thing. Anyway, that was the background.
Oh, thank you for that historical knowledge there. There was a slight divergence. Just coming back to the Greenbelt purposes, though, and Mr. Cross, could you just summarise the overall contribution which the site currently makes to Greenbelt purposes? And in doing so, I just want to sort of ask you to reflect on something which we discussed in the Greenbelt session previously, in terms of the fact that, you know, the various purposes of the Greenbelt don't carry a greater weight, but in some circumstances, for example, the gap may be more material in determination. So in summing up, if you could just address that point, please.
Yes, thank you. The overall summary for GB purpose for the larger site was assessed as having a moderate contribution towards including land within the Greenbelt. As was discussed whenever we looked at in more detail at the Greenbelt study, I say yes, there's in order to generate the thematic mapping, there is scoring behind the Greenbelt study, and effectively each of the three purposes that were individually assessed were all scored or weighted equally. However, I say we have clearly stated that in certain locations, particularly where the gap is particularly narrow, that is a purpose that would basically weigh more heavily on your mind in terms of the potential impact of losing a site from the Greenbelt and allocating it for development.
And obviously, the site assessment identifies that this site plays an important role in preventing neighbouring towns from merging. Was the sort of issue of the gap given greater weight in this instance? For example, in the Greenbelt assessment?
As I say, in terms of the overall scoring, in terms of the mapping for the conclusion, no, that's a simple, say, arithmetic without the application of additional judgment, so there's no additional weighting applied to that. However, in interpreting the results and judging on balance, the results of the Greenbelt study together with the other information that we had available, then obviously yes, I say in terms of the potential impact and the potential for closing or significantly reducing the Greenbelt gap as something that was considered. Again, as with the sites W4 and W5, we're tight up against the border boundary. The land on the other side of the line is allocated Greenbelt. It was recently reviewed by a neighbouring authority, Knowsley, who did similarly undertake a comprehensive Greenbelt study. They've confirmed the land is Greenbelt, and I would say, including the housing development on Hale, they didn't choose to take that out of the Greenbelt, and they didn't raise the issue with Halton at the time with regard to potential knock-on effect of our plan and our potential Greenbelt releases with regard to whether they should be mirroring the approach on their side of the line. It might be a matter of timing, but to say at the moment the Greenbelts around Cronton, immediately around Cronton, is within Knowsley, and it's been confirmed in a recent plan, so I'd be surprised if that won't be revisited in the short to medium term.
Okay, thank you. But those discussions took place through the duty to cooperate, as we've already touched on in previous sessions. I'm guessing, Mr. Mitchell, your representations disagree with the overall sort of contribution which the site makes to Greenbelt purposes. Do you want to come in at this point?
I don't think I do, Mark. I mean, we've got our submissions. We've made that very clear. We've made the case that it doesn't perform the role. It is a site that's logically very contained and was a candidate site right from the outset, which the council was originally supportive of. The difference we have between the council is that we think it should be allocated now rather than downgraded. On the context of Knowlesley, I did sit through and was involved with the Knowlesley local plan inquiry at its various stages. I think there's a slight difference there, which is their spatial approach is very much built around development to the north of the M62. So it's not the land that they've got within south of the M62 is very logical to be retained in Greenbelt. I don't think it's anything more than that, given their spatial context.
Okay, Mr. Mitchell, in terms of the case you're making that the site should be brought forward, and your views in terms of the role that the site makes in terms of Greenbelt, the contribution to Greenbelt purposes. Presumably, your view is founded on your opinion as to the contribution which the site makes to Greenbelt purposes.
Yeah, and that's been set out in our examination statement and our previous submissions that we made at the publication draft stage. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McGrath.
Just to confirm that whilst there may be some differences in terms of the particular purposes of the Greenbelt, the overall conclusion to release a site from the Greenbelt, we don't dispute the council's conclusions.
Okay, I mean, obviously the overall assessment was that it made a moderate contribution to Greenbelt purposes. So what you're saying is you don't disagree with that overall assessment, Ms. McGrath?
Yes.
Mr. Mitchell, in terms of the overall contribution, do you disagree that it would be a moderate contribution?
Well, we got it to a weak contribution in our statement, Ma'am, but you've got our rationale and discussion in our statement on our evidence, so I don't think necessarily need to go through that further now.
Okay, thank you for your brevity. I'm sure some stomachs rumbling there, waiting to go for lunch. Mr. Harper, on that note, if you could maybe keep your submissions equally brief, thank you.
Strong. I vote strong. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Right. On that note, it's now 1 o'clock, so I'm proposing to adjourn the discussion until 2 o'clock, and we'll see you back then. Okay, thank you.